Okay, I have 1 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. I realize this is a talk about statistics right after lunch, and so in effort to keep anybody from falling asleep, I want to start off with a joke. And the level of laughter after this joke will tell me how much time we need to spend on the econometrics slide in this PowerPoint presentation. So here it goes. 3 econometricians go deer hunting. So they get out into the woods, and they come upon this meadow, and they see a deer. A deer approaches them. So the first econometrician gets his rifle ready, and he takes aim and shoots, but he misses 3 feet to the left. So the deer doesn't run off for some reason. That's how the joke goes. And the next econometrician takes aim and shoots and misses 3 feet to the right. The third econometrician starts jumping up and down saying, "We got it, we got it." So, okay. I deserve no applause. This is not my joke, but there was a decent level of laughter. Maybe we can do the econometric slide pretty quickly. The first thing that I want to do before we get into talking about the differences in the way Austrians and mainstream economists deal with statistics and data is I want to immediately dispel this stereotype that Austrians have that we're afraid of numbers. Has anybody seen that or at least heard jokes about that? So, Austrians are Austrians because they are bad at math, or they're afraid of numbers, they're afraid of how they can handle all of the math that is involved in mainstream economics. And I've been thinking about this over the course of the week while I was watching the lectures. Austrians actually have a healthy respect for numbers, and if you consider the 2 big contributions that the Austrian School has, namely the socialist calculation argument, or the impossibility of economic calculation under socialism, and also our business cycle theory, numbers are very important in both of those stories. So if you think about the socialist calculation debate, the whole point that Austrians make is that entrepreneurs have the wrong numbers, or they don't have numbers. They don't have the numbers that they need to calculate profit and loss, and therefore they make all of these errors, and we can't satisfy consumer demands, and it's because of a lack of good numbers. It's because of a lack of the data that entrepreneurs need. And the same applies to Austrian business cycle theory. So there's the central bank increases the amount of money in the economy, and it goes through credit markets, and that this depresses interest rates below the pure time preference rate of interest, and it causes all of these other problems. So it's because there are errors in the numbers that entrepreneurs are receiving that they make all these mistakes, and consumers overconsume. So it's not quite right to say that Austrians are afraid of numbers per se. We don't do a lot of math, and we'll talk about why in just a moment. But it's not fair to say that we're just afraid of numbers, because you could see the numbers are very important in 2 of the main Austrian contributions. So another preface here. I've got some essential reading for you. We're at day 3 of Mises University, so I'm sure everybody's reading list is about yay high. And here's some more for you. So I have Murray Rothbard's Toward a Reconstruction of Utility and Welfare Economics. This is one of my favorite papers by Murray Rothbard. And I think that if a lot of mainstream economists would read this, they might start to reconsider the way that they do especially consumer behavior and consumer economics. He bases utility and welfare on demonstrated preference as opposed to utility functions, and he also bases it on what's called the unanimity principle. So it's a very, very foundational paper. I recommend everybody read it. Another paper that I like to recommend is by Roderick Long. It's called Realism and Abstraction in Economics, Aristotle and Mises versus Friedman. And here, Roderick Long makes a distinction between precisive and non-precisive abstractions. And he shows how a lot of the errors that come from the mainstream way of doing economics come from the fact that they make precisive abstractions, which is to say they have this idealized formal model of the way a consumer behaves, for example, and a lot of things are specified as absent. So there are no extra frictions, there are no changes in psychology, there's no other things that might change the way the consumer will behave. And so we model consumer behavior based on this equation. Anything else that might change what consumers actually do are outside of the system, and we can't really deal with that. And so a lot of times it's interpreted as irrational behavior or market failures or something like that, as opposed to the Austrian method, in which a lot of the specifics of action are intentionally left unspecified. So it's a non-precisive abstraction. We say it doesn't matter what's in the different slots on the preference ranking. It doesn't matter if it's apples or oranges, diminishing marginal utility applies no matter what. And so those are the sorts of abstractions that are made in the causal realist tradition. So I highly recommend that paper. I have this page range from Human Action, the Scholars Edition. This is where Mises walks through the difficulties and issues in using math and economics. Another paper, this is actually a chapter in the Economics and Ethics of Private Property by Hans Hermann Hoppe. He goes through two different ways that we can interpret econometric results. And so there's one safe way or innocuous way of interpreting econometric results, which is that you've got one variable and another variable, possibly more. And when you run the regression and you estimate the slopes on these, you estimate the slopes, what you found is a correlation between one or more variables. And that's it. It applies to those subjects, it applies to that time period, and it's just a correlation. Another way of interpreting those econometric results is a more, it's incorrect, would be to infer causation from that correlation, which is famous. But Hoppe also shows how a lot of times when people are interpreting econometric results, they not only imply causation, but they also say this correlation applies for all peoples, so not just for the subjects at hand, and also for all time. And so a lot of times people think that they found this universal relationship between two or more variables in econometric results when Hoppe shows that you can't make those sorts of conclusions. And finally, I have three from Murray Rothbard. In Statistics, the Achilles heel of government, this is in Economic Controversies. I highly recommend you get a copy of this or find it online. It's online for free. Great compilation of Rothbard's papers. In this article, he shows some of the nefarious things that governments can do with data that they have. Two more from Rothbard. There's the Austrian definition of the supply of money. So here you can get a good, this is a good example of an Austrian economist taking an approach to data, taking an approach to statistics. What can we do with statistics? What is the best way that we can think of statistics based on our economic theory? So it's a good example there. And then finally, you see a great distinction between theory and history, or economic theory and economic history in America's Great Depression by Rothbard. So Rothbard shows a proper way of using statistics in this example. Okay, so I've got two little snapshots here, one from Austrian economics and another one from the mainstream. I literally just did a random pick. I did not do any searching here. I used what I found first. And so I took Man, Economy, and State, opened it up to a random page, found a footnote, and lo and behold, we got a great example of Rothbard using logical deduction, using the method of the Austrian School. And so in this footnote here, I don't want to read all of it, he's showing what happens if we have discrete goods that are being exchanged in a market. And he talks about if we have this, then that implies this. If we have the opposite case, then that implies this. And so it's qualitative, it's logical. This is the way that Austrians come up with good economic theory, is just through this logical deductive method. In the mainstream, however, the backbone of economic theory is mathematical models. So we stipulate that humans behave in a certain way, and you see the results. So this is just the first article that I could find that was in one of the, I think it was from the National Bureau of Economic Statistics, or National Bureau of Economic Research, their working papers. It was one of the first ones that I found, and it just sort of looks like gobbledygook. So you think that economics, if it's a science of human action, of people making choices, it should be at least a little bit intuitive. It should make sense to us because we do this sort of thing on a day-to-day basis. We make choices. So which one looks more intuitive to you? Which one seems like it represents the way you make choices on a day-to-day basis? And so I would argue that the left-hand side wins. I want to spend a little bit of time just reviewing quickly mainstream microeconomics, mainstream macroeconomics, and econometrics, because in so doing, we'll see why the mainstream has the statistics that they have, and why they use them in the way that they do. So here's just mainstream microeconomics. I'm looking specifically at consumer behavior in a nutshell. So we have individual agents selecting bundles of goods to consume, and their consumption of those bundles allows them to achieve a certain level of utility. And the way that this is graphically represented is with an indifference curve. So here we have an indifference curve in the top right. So some consumer can achieve different levels of utility. However, there's certain combinations where if you increase one good and decrease another, then you can attain the same level of utility. And all the points that satisfy that condition are called an indifference curve. And so what the consumer does, as you can see in the bottom right hand, is they take their budget set, which is a linear combination, it's a linear relationship, and they try to achieve the highest level of utility that they can by finding that tangency between the budget set and the indifference curve. So they consume as much as they can, constrained by their budget. And so what this means is that all consumer behavior in mainstream microeconomics can be boiled down to a simple calculus. Well, it's simple depending on your perspective. It can be boiled down to a simple calculus problem. So we engage in constrained optimization. We have one function, another function. How do we maximize this one subject to the constraints of this one? And a lot of times, here, I have one example here of a common utility function called a Cobb-Douglas utility function. So this consumer's utility is based on the consumption of two goods, X and Y, and it's based on X to the alpha times Y to the beta. And then there's a separate function that describes their budget set. Compare that to how we conceive of consumer behavior or human action in the causal realist tradition. So you'll notice just by looking at the slide, it's more qualitative, it's more verbal. And so the individuals act to bring about a preferred state. Preference is only demonstrated in action. Action is the use of means for a purpose, the attainment of an end. In action, less important ends are foregone to attain more important ends. And that just about sums up what causal realist economists, what Austrian economists say about human action. And so they're very different. One criticism that I see sometimes is that it's oversimplified. So here I've just summarized human action in 4 bullet points. If you compare that to what this screen looks like, which is the basics of neoclassical microeconomics, one criticism that I see is that this method here, the neoclassical one, is more sophisticated. So since it's more sophisticated, there's more numbers, we can do more with it. However, I would argue that what we achieve with these 4 bullet points here, and you could arrange them in different ways, what we achieve is better. We achieve like this in epistemological grounds, more rock solid foundations. We can do more and say more. We're more free because we know the boundaries of what we're able to say with this sort of description of the way humans behave, as opposed to having all of these precisive abstractions, all of this math that it allows us to do math problems, but doesn't actually describe the way real humans behave. So. Quickly, just some immediate observations on the differences between these two methods. The two approaches are answering different questions. So in the mainstream, they're modeling behavior to make good predictions. This is very important. So from the starting point, the 2 different strains of economic thought have different goals. In the mainstream, they're trying to make good predictions. And in the causal realist tradition, they're trying to explain and understand real-world phenomena. So we look at how actual humans make actual choices based on their condition, based on the state of the world that they find themselves in, and then they seek other states of the world through action. So they're doing different things. The 2 different strains of economic thought are doing different things, they're answering different questions. They're also doing things in very different ways. So in the mainstream, consumers use or act as if they use math to make decisions. And I've got this meme here. So here's a young couple. They're trying to decide if they would like to have some children. And so the man asks his wife, should we have more kids? The wife says, let's consult our utility function. And then they think really hard. They do lots of math in their head. They plug the numbers into their utility function, and then instantaneously out pop a couple kids. So this is a straw man. Neoclassical or mainstream economics or economists would not necessarily say that we actually do this. So that would be a very large assumption. We don't actually do math as we're walking down the grocery store aisle. What they would say is we act as if we do. And what that means is that, I'm going down a rabbit trail here. What that means is whenever we don't act as if we're using math, then that means we're acting irrationally, which means that there's some possible way that for a government to intervene to correct our choices because we're acting in a irrational way. The elements are conceived in different ways. So in the mainstream, continuous goods are consumed to achieve a certain level of utility. It has to be continuous so that you can take derivatives, so that you can do that constrained optimization problem. However, in the real world, goods are not continuous. And so in the causal realist tradition, we say that there are discrete goods that are consumed to attain a certain ordinally ranked end. So we seek some qualitatively defined state of affairs that we would wish to see, and we combine means to attain that end. The scope of the consumer's knowledge is also very different. So on that indifference curve, there's every possible combination of goods that can be consumed by the consumer. And what that implies is that in order for consumers to make a rational decision, they have to rule out all of the other possible alternatives and know about them, know those combinations, as opposed to in the causal realist tradition, all that the consumer necessarily is thinking about is what state of the world do I want to achieve or attain, and what state of the world am I foregoing by pursuing action in this way. Okay, now a brief overview of mainstream macroeconomics. We're going fast here. So that was a whole course on microeconomics, in 10 minutes maybe. Mainstream macroeconomics is really all based on this circular flow diagram. So just a quick primer on this. We've got firms and households are interacting with each other in two different markets. So households and individuals are trading with firms. They're trading goods and services, and they're also trading factors of production. So we get this flow of money all the way through the economy. And this flow of spending, as we'll see later, is a national income. So it's the same flow all the way around, and what GDP seeks to measure is this flow of spending. There were a few models in between, but the circular flow model led to the income and expenditure approach by Keynes and the ISLM model, and then finally to the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model that we see here in the top left. Some other big models in macroeconomics are the solo growth model, endogenous growth, the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model, which is actually, I think, decreasing in popularity these days, and we'll see why later, and also new Keynesian models. So these models, you're applying shocks to the economy and seeing how it reacts, but the economy is, once again, just an equation. So you change a number really fast, and you see how long does it take for this equation to reach another equilibrium after you apply that shock. The short story here is it's all math. It's all equations, it's all math, and so that's why, as we'll see, the mainstream economists find the statistics that they find and use the statistics that they find in a certain way. Okay, so the first of these statistics that I want to talk about is gross domestic product, or GDP. You can open up any standard textbook and find this definition. It's the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country over a given time period. The reason it's the market value is because that's the common denominator that they can use. They can't use weight because some of the services don't have weight. So there's no other common denominator that they can use besides market prices. So they use the market prices. Importantly, intermediate goods are excluded. So it's only final goods and services that are included. And they do that so that they can avoid a double counting problem. So if you count the flour that the baker uses to make the bread, and then you count the bread, which contains the flour, then in their view, you're double counting the flour that's the intermediate good in this process. So they try to exclude spending on intermediate goods. Also, only domestic production is included. They're trying to net out the things that we consume here in this country that were produced in other countries, because GDP is domestic products, so they're trying to get a handle on what sort of things are produced in our economy, in our country. And it's a flow variable, so it's over a certain time period, usually a year, but you can also find quarterly GDP figures. Another equation that you'll see commonly with this GDP figure is the Y, national income, or GDP is the specific measure of national income, is equal to C plus I plus G plus net exports, or exports minus imports. The C is consumption spending, I is investment spending, G is government spending, and then exports X and subtract out imports. All right, so I'm going to quickly go through these issues with GDP, and the reason I'm going to go through these issues quickly is because you can find these in a lot of textbooks, mainstream textbooks even. But on the next slide, I have some that are particularly Austrian criticisms of GDP. So the first four here, household production is ignored. So I mow my own grass. That's a part of national product. I'm producing a freshly mown grass. It's something that I value. But since I don't trade it on a market, there's no market price for that. It gets excluded in GDP. Black market transactions are obviously excluded, or maybe they can be estimated. This can be really massive, actually. I've seen estimates from 25% to 40% of the economy is under the radar. So this can be from tax evasion, or can be the sale of illegal goods. So that can be a very huge gap in estimated GDP figures. This third point here has more to do with the way GDP is used as opposed to the actual figure itself and how it's calculated. A lot of times you'll see people use GDP per capita, so you take GDP and divide it by the population. They'll use that as a measure of happiness or well-being for the citizens of that country, and then you can make inter-country, international comparisons. And there are quite a few issues with that. One issue is that if you try to come up with a correlation of GDP per capita with what survey data says, how people have self-reported, how happy they are, there are many issues with survey data as well, but you would expect that if they're measuring the same thing, they would be correlated. There is no such correlation. And so happiness, there is no measure of happiness, and obviously GDP per capita is gonna have some issues with that as well. A fourth issue that you'll find in most textbooks is that leisure is valuable. So sometimes we voluntarily stop producing. So we have weekends. We only work a certain number of hours per day. So we stop producing because we value the alternative. We value leisure. We value, sitting on the couch and binge watching Stranger Things or something. So we're not producing, but we're getting something that we prefer. We're getting something that we value. But if we engaged in more leisure, even though we're getting something that we want, this would result in a decrease in gross domestic product. Okay, so these three here are more Austrian-specific criticisms of GDP. Austrians are very good at pointing out that we need to disaggregate things. So we disaggregate the structure of production into its different stages. The Austrians also say that GDP has an aggregation problem. So even though there's this common denominator of market prices, there's still an apples and oranges problem. The stuff that's inside GDP is heterogeneous. So you have consumption spending, you have some investment spending, and that investment spending is only the final capital goods that are in the structure of production. You have the government spending, which I have a whole nother point dedicated to. But the point here is that with one GDP figure, you don't see what's inside it. You don't see a growth potential. You don't see the distribution of wealth inside the economy. You don't see the distribution of income inside the economy. So there's an aggregation problem, even though there's a common unit. Austrians would say that a better measure of economic health would not be GDP, but the level of savings in the economy, perhaps. So we would look at how much are people not spending on final consumption goods? How much are they investing? And this would give us a better picture of the growth potential for the country. Number 6, consumption is exaggerated and international trade is understated. So if you look at just GDP, since it's only including final goods and services, you're missing out on a lot of the spending that happens in the structure of production. And so if you just look at the components of GDP, consumption spending has a very large role. It's very large in proportion to the other components. It's like 70%, I think, is the last number that I saw. So if you're looking at GDP figures and you're a politician or you're in DC and you're coming up with policy and you're looking at GDP, it looks like consumption is extremely important for the economy. However, if we look at all expenditure in the economy, including the intermediate goods in the structure of production, then consumption spending has a much smaller role to play in the size and the health of the economy, including that caveat about saving. International trade is also understated. Let me go back to the equation here. So C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So the exports is added and imports are subtracted. So if we have $100 billion worth of exports and $100 billion worth of imports, that net export component is 0. And so likewise, with the case of policymakers looking at the size of consumption and what sort of influence does that have on our economic health? If you're looking at net exports, it looks like this has a very minimal or insignificant role to play in the health of the economy, whereas as we saw earlier in the lecture on the division of labor and also the one on free trade and protectionism, international trade is extremely important for the health of the economy. So we need to exploit the international division of labor. So exports are important. All right, number 7. This is perhaps the most significant criticism of GDP that Austrians have, and we'll see that the way that Austrians have countered this or tried to get around this problem, government expenditures are categorically different from the other components. Without market prices and the profit loss test, there's no way to measure what the government produces or the benefit of what the government produces. All government expenditures are also made possible by taking from the private economy. So we have this productive component of the economy where we're producing things that are in line with consumer demand, and then there's this other institution in the economy that's taking from that. And so since government expenditures and government programs are not subject to the profit and loss test, there's no way for us to say for sure that what the government is doing is productive or value productive. The best we can say is, I don't know. However, it's quite easy to say a lot of the things that the government is doing is actually destructive. And so we'll see how different authors have dealt with that. Like Bob Higgs, one of my favorite Austrian authors. Highly recommend his book, Crisis in Leviathan. He has taken a look at GDP during World War II. And if you look at GDP during World War II, it just skyrocketed in the beginning as the government started increasing its purchases of war goods. So we turned into this war economy and GDP skyrocketed. So it looks like, we're having this great party. So if you consider GDP as a measure of economic health, oh boy, the US economy looks great during this period. However, what Higgs does is he takes out the government spending component. And you'll notice there's a dip. So you see those black bars at the bottom, there's a dip in what's left over, the private product for the private economy after you take out the government spending. And this actually is more in line with what consumers felt during this period. So there was rationed consumer staples, and so people actually weren't better off. There was a huge restructuring of production away from what consumers want and towards what it takes to wage a war. And so if you want a picture of how consumers are actually feeling, then this private GDP is a better figure. So this is just one example of the benefit of this exercise of taking out the government spending component of GDP. Higgs also points out that if you look at the end of the war, there's this major collapse in GDP. It looks like the worst depression that the United States has ever experienced. But if you actually looked at what people could consume, if you looked at private product, there was actually a huge boom. So the private domestic product, private GDP, there was an increase, a massive increase. It was great because all these soldiers were coming home. There was a restructuring of the economy away from producing war goods and back towards producing what consumers demand, like butter and food. I like food. David Howden has also an exercise in what we can say, what we can do, program of taking government spending out of GDP and seeing what you can say about real workers, real people in the economy. You can also, the top black line is the government spending per public worker. It seems very large, doesn't it? So you can think of this as total compensation on average for all. So in Rothbard's perspective, the government spending it's not just wasteful, it's not just, I don't know, he considers it a depredation on the private economy. So they're actually moving resources not just away, but moving them in a certain way that's actually detrimental to the entire economy. So he subtracts it twice. And he calls it the private product remaining. Okay, so back to comparing the mainstream macroeconomics and Austrian macroeconomics, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in my talk tomorrow. Here's the Austrian approach to considering all economic activity in an economy. So we have Böhm-Bawerk's concentric circles in the stages of production, Hayek's triangle or trapezoid, depending on who you talk to. And then Rothbard has a similar sort of diagram in Man, Economy, and State. And then Roger Garrison is credited with taking this triangle and turning it on its side. This is my tribute to Roger Garrison's wonderful PowerPoints. This is the best I could do, I guess. So here's Garrison's structure of production. The whole point of this structure of production is to show production existing in stages. So we start with natural resources, research and development, and we move them through a production process. So we have to refine these natural resources. We manufacture them into different shapes. We transport them across the country in different directions. And then we put it on the shelves in a retail shop. And then we're at the very end of the structure of production, we have total consumption spending. So this is how Austrians conceive of the economy, the entire economy. This is like the best way to summarize it, I would say. But what that means is there's lots of spending here in the structure of production that's not included in the GDP figures. And so this is where Austrians get what's called gross output. And Rothbard and Mark Skousen are big advocates for using gross output as opposed to gross domestic product. Because gross output includes the intermediate goods, the spending on intermediate goods in those stages. So this is total spending in the economy, not GDP. And one major advantage of this over GDP is that, first of all, you'll notice that there's more variation in recessions, and it's because the spending on intermediate products is included. So that's what happens during a bust. So during a business cycle, there's this bust, there's this entire reshuffling of where capital goods are in the stages of production. And so there's a big collapse in spending as people abandon these projects. And so notice in the gross output, which is the top line, there's this big fall in total expenditures because it includes the spending on those goods, where you don't see that as much in GDP. So it tracks better with the business cycle. Another major advantage of gross output is it puts consumption in its place. So if saving and investment is what drives economic growth, and in gross output, a lot of that investment spending is included now, where it's not included in GDP. And so we actually put consumption spending in its place. I think it's around 25 or 30% in gross output figures. The official statistics for gross output didn't start until 2014, so this is a relatively new piece of data that we have. And I encourage young researchers out there to take advantage of this. Another major macroeconomic statistic that is used in the mainstream is the price, or CPI is the most popular measure of the price level. The price level is this idea, what is the level of prices in the economy? One specific measure of which, the most popular specific measure is CPI. There are plenty of others. And I can go through this quickly as well. The main issue with coming up with one number for the price level from the mainstream economist perspective is there's no common denominator, there's no common unit. So prices are ratios. So unlike GDP, which is price times quantity, you'll notice here I've got this hypothetical economy with burritos and haircuts and Lamborghinis. So there's no units problem when you're calculating GDP. You see that in the calculation in the bottom. So here you get nominal GDP, and the units cancel out. So the burritos in the numerator cancel out with the burritos in the denominator. And same with the haircuts and the Lamborghinis. And what you're left with is $1 figure, total spending on the final goods and services, blah, blah, blah. So it's one of those, what some economists call happy aggregates, because it's got a common unit. This is not the case for prices. So prices are dollars per unit. So when you go to buy a burrito at Chipotle, for example, down the road, you pay $10 for a burrito, if you get the guacamole, which I highly recommend. And notice this is a ratio, it's dollars per burrito. So if we include the other, suppose in this hypothetical three-good economy, we wanted to come up with something like the average price. We might take the price of the burrito, the price of the haircut, and the price of the Lamborghini, add them all up and divide by 3. You get this number, 131,000. But if you consider what the units are, it's dollars per 1/3 of a burrito and 1/3 of a haircut and 1/3 of a Lamborghini, which is just nonsense. It's meaningless. And so since you can't come up with an average price in this way, what the mainstream or conventional way of dealing with this is using an index. So the way they do this is they come up with a basket of goods, and they use survey data. I think the Bureau of Labor Statistics conducts a survey. They try to figure out what's important to the average consumer based on the survey data. And the results of the survey give you a basket of goods that's important. They tally up the price of this basket from one year to the next. And each time they do that, they compare it to one common year, one common base year, which means that we have a common denominator now. So this is how all indices are created. But the common denominator is the price of the basket in the arbitrarily chosen base year. And so this allows you to come up with different price indices. For example, the consumer price index. the price of each bundle, the price of each basket is compared to the price of the basket in the base year, multiplied by 100, I guess, to make the numbers easier to work with, and you get calculations like this. I'm going fast because I think everybody is pretty familiar with the way this is calculated. So what are some of the issues? This is where we're concerned. Even with indexing, there's an apples and oranges problem. So we've got, haircuts and burritos lumped together. This is especially the case if you're looking at changes in CPI from one year to the next. So they redo this survey whenever the consumer preferences change, which is all the time. So every year there's a different basket of goods that's being compared to the base year. So in this year's CPI calculation, they'll include the price of a Blu-ray player, but this was not included in the CPI that was calculated for 1957, obviously. So the basket that's being compared is different. The qualities of the goods are changing as well. So this has major implications. One important Austrian criticism of CPI and other price indices is that it hides Cantillon effects. So Cantillon effects are very important to Austrians because, well, mainly for Austrian business cycle theory. So Austrian business cycle theory is a special application of Cantillon effects. And so if you're just looking at CPI, you don't see new money rippling through the economy, bidding up prices. You just see the one number increasing. Another issue with CPI is that it hides changes in relative prices. So in the example that I calculated previously, the Lamborghini could have increased in price, and the burrito and the haircut could have decreased in price, which means that the relative prices are changing, but the CPI figure disguises that. You can't see that if you're just looking at CPI figures. Probably the most important Austrian criticism of the price level is the fact that it doesn't exist. So there is no such thing as the price level in economic theory. And in Man, Economy, and State, Rothbard says this is during a discussion on stabilization policy, which we'll talk about some more tomorrow. So arguments for using government policy to stabilize prices throughout the economy. And so Rothbard says this contention rests on the myth that some sort of general purchasing power of money or some sort of price level exists on a plane apart from specific prices in specific transactions. As we have seen, this is purely fallacious. There is no price level, and there's no way that the exchange value of money is manifested except in the specific purchases of goods, that is the specific prices. So the Austrian position is that the only way to think about the price level is as an array of all of the specific prices that people pay. It's not one number, it's all the numbers that are in the prices that we pay. There are quite a few different conventional statistics for the money supply. There's M1, M2, M3, and the way these are arranged and put together is based on liquidity. So you decrease in liquidity as you increase the number. I don't even know how high they go. I think I've seen M5 before. I'm not sure how high up they go, but as you go up these different money supply measures, the idea is that they're adding elements to the money supply that are less liquid than previously. And Professor Salerno and Murray Rothbard have done great work on this. They've come up with an Austrian definition of the supply of money. They call it the true money supply. Great name, by the way. So this is the true one, as opposed to all the fake ones. So the Austrian true money supply, one way to think about it is you can think about it as M2 minus traveler's checks, time deposits, and money market mutual fund shares. However, the money market deposit accounts are okay. And the reason, well, I guess I should back up and say why they include these things and not the other things. And the reason why is they're looking at components of the money supply that are immediately spendable. What is the final means of payment? So you exclude credit transactions, you exclude things where it looks like I'm paying for something now, but it's the final payment for it actually comes later. So you can only include things that are the widely accepted medium of exchange, meaning what is used in the final payment for the good, not other things. U.S. savings bonds can be counted, which sounds counterintuitive, but they have to be included at a discounted rate. So if you can cash them out early, it's discounted, but it's immediately spendable, so it can go into the true money supply. The cash surrender value of life insurance policies, I recommend if you want to talk about these, talk with Robert Murphy. And U.S. Treasury and government deposits at the Federal Reserve are added. So anything that's immediately spendable, anything that's included as the final means of payment. Have I missed anything? Okay, good. Yes. One benefit of the true money supply is it actually accords with economic experience. So if you look at the relationship of the true money supply and actual financial crises and recessions in US history, there's a much tighter correlation. They go together. This image is from an article that Joe Salerno wrote, I think it was last year. I don't think he made this image, but it still shows changes in the true money supply and how the dips are timed with the financial crises or the bust of a boom bust cycle. And here we see the fruits of using good causal realist Austrian theory to come up with a better statistic, a better piece of data, and how it actually it correlates better with other pieces of data that we would find in the economy, like changes in real GDP or financial crises. Okay, I'm going to skip econometrics because we're running out of time, and you guys laughed so great at my joke earlier. I just want to show some of the outcomes in the mainstream. So at the Federal Reserve, with all of their high-powered models, all of their great data that they have, they're still notoriously bad at making predictions. So here, one of my favorite graphs is this one on the right-hand side. So this is the Federal Reserve predicting their own policy variable. They're predicting their own federal funds rate that they'll set or that they'll target. And you'll notice that they overestimated. And so one kind way to interpret this is that they're trying to have some sort of announcement effect. So they're trying to say the economy will be better because of our wise judgment and our wise policy making than it actually turns out to be. Another way to interpret it is that their models are junk and their data is junk. Here's another example of that. Here in this graph, you see the expectations of the different FOMC committee members, FOMC members, should just say. And also, it's compared to what the market expects. So you can actually get an implied prediction from markets where people are actually putting their money where their mouth is, where they're actually committing dollars to this prediction of what the federal funds rate will be. And you'll notice I have just in the text that the market expectations were closer than the always overestimated predictions from the FOMC. Here's a more recent example from this year. So the actual yield on a 10-year Treasury note is mapped in black, and then they surveyed a certain number, looks like a couple dozen, top economists as to what their predictions would be at the beginning of the year. And you'll notice that they all were wrong, and significantly so. So there's something wrong, I guess we can conclude. One final point that I want to make is the Misesian distinction between theory and history, and this is what all of this discussion really boils down to: is what actually do Austrian economists do with data? So we're not afraid of data, we're not afraid of numbers. We can do math. I'm pretty good at math, I would say. But what is the role of data? What is the role of statistics in the way we do economics? And so this comes down to the Misesian distinction between theory and history. So according to Mises, economic theory is deduced logically. So we have praxeology, the science of human action, and we start with this action axiom, and we develop the economic theory based on this through logical deduction. It pertains to all choices ever made by anybody. The particulars of the choice are not relevant. It goes back to the precisive versus non-precisive abstractions. Specific motivations are not relevant. This all goes into why economic theory is so universally relevant to all choices ever made by anybody. Importantly, it's not falsifiable by observation or experience. So if you come up with something that's logically true in praxeology, then there's no observation that you can make that would say, oh, actually, demand curves might slope upward. So there's no way that you can observe the world and refute or as a proof against what was derived logically. For the same example that the Pythagorean theorem explains this relationship between the length of the sides of a right triangle. So if you went out and you actually started measuring real-world right triangles, you might find a measurement that doesn't accord with the Pythagorean theorem. And so the question is, would you say, oh, I've just disproved the Pythagorean theorem? Or would you take a closer look at your ruler? Or maybe the thing that you were measuring wasn't actually a right triangle. So this is a good example of how Austrians think about theory and its relationship to experience. Our goal in economic theory is to come up with cause and effect, not and not look at mathematical equations, and our goal is also not to make predictions. And some good examples of developing the edifice of economic theory you can find in Human Action and in Man, Economy, and State. This is contrasted to economic history, or doing history, in which we apply theory to the past. We can identify particulars, we can guess motivations. It's open to interpretation. We can use the good economic theory that we've developed to help us interpret and think about what has happened in the past. But importantly, what has happened in the past really only has indirect bearing on the way we do theory. So if we notice something is happening, that might cause us to take another look at the theory. But that's as much as we can say about that. But there's still no constant relationships. So when we're doing economic history, we can't say that this relationship, this correlation occurred in the past and it's not going to occur, or it will occur the exact same way in the future. So this distinction, I would say, summarizes the Austrian view of statistics, because statistics is just experience, it's observation. And with that, we'll end. Thank you very much.
Hey, Jeff. Hey, though. I just go for this. We're not recording. Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started here? I know some people are still trickling them, that's fine. So first, let me just mention, this is the first time I've spoken to you guys at this conference, so let me just mention it because I've had some people asking about it. So as many of you probably know, on the Contra Cruise, which was last week, I debated Tom Woods, and we had this sort of side agreement that the loser of that debate would shave his beard. Now, I did something sort of a logic puzzle here. Because I shaved, does that mean I lost the debate? Not necessarily. Okay, now, what you also would need to really cement it was to see Tom's face, and so I'll just leave that open to your imagination. So for this talk today, let me mention on the plane back from Seattle, there was this guy sitting next to me, and I was working on this presentation, and so then, and I could, it was a 6-hour flight, and I could tell at some point, he was like working up the courage to ask me. And finally, he said, yeah, this presentation you're doing, the economics of the Green New Deal, if you want to like try it out on somebody, would you do it on me? And so I said, no. This is like, I fail to see how that benefits me. But I did tell him I was gonna email him afterwards. So if at times it seems like I'm being very clear and not making inside jokes, that's why. Some of you may say, that was the clearest presentation Murphy's ever given. And that's probably why it's gonna be that way. The other thing though he said that was intriguing is at the end, he said something like, a lot of us agree with you. And I think, so I don't know, because I don't know how much he was seeing or whatever, but I think what he was saying is, yeah, we realize, because obviously, as you can guess, probably, I'm not going to be on board with this. It's not that AOC and I are joined at the hip on this. And so I guess he was trying to let me know that, oh, yes, in liberal Seattle, a lot of people talk like this, but, secretly, a lot of people agree with you. So, vive la resistance, my brother. And I hope you're not watching this at work. Just, if you are, just blame it on me and say I misunderstood. Okay, so the other sort of caveat I'll give here with this one is, I mean, it's appropriate, this is topical, and certainly I think most Austrian economists would be fine with the stuff I'm gonna say here, but as you'll see as I go through this, I'm not gonna make like methodological critiques or something and say, oh yes, they have their utility functions and in their models, everything makes sense and we should have a Green New Deal, but we Austrians, know that value is subjective. That's not what I'm gonna be doing. So that stuff's all true, of course, but I think that concedes too much to the advocates of aggressive government intervention in the name of fighting climate change. So I am an economist at what's called the Institute for Energy Research, and that's where a lot of my work that you're gonna see here, that's where I do it, and I'm just summarizing some of the key takeaway points. But in that capacity, I went into it, thinking like, oh gee, we've been lectured to for years about how the consensus is out there and the science is settled, and the only people who could possibly doubt the need for aggressive government intervention are people who don't understand science or hacks who are in the pay of big oil. And really that's not true. So as you'll see as I go through this, all you have to do is read the reports put out by like the UN or the Obama administration, and you'll see that the consensus science does not at all support the aggressive policy measures, all right? So don't misunderstand me. I'm not up here saying, oh, I don't believe in climate change. That's sort of a bait and switch in and of itself. They lead you to believe that you have to deny basic chemistry or physics in order to not have the conclusion pop out that, the government needs to slap on a big carbon tax, or people need to stop eating so much meat, or people need to stop having so many kids, or else we're all dead. That is just not at all supported, again, by the very documents that are being held up as the consensus science, all right? So if you want to see more on that general theme, a talk I gave at previous Mises U's, what's the plural of Mises U? Is it Mises U's? That sounds kind of funny, but in any event, the previous episodes of Mises U, talks I gave there about the Paris Climate Agreement, okay? So you'll see more. If you want to see more about in terms of just like the 2 degrees Celsius target, is that really supported by the literature? And it turns out, no, it actually isn't. And yet that's just an article of faith. In fact, now the UN's telling people, governments, how to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, all right? So that's the spirit in which I'm gonna go through this, is just to show you that it's amazing to me. Like when you just delve into it a little bit, you don't even have to be a trained economist to read it. All you have to do is have the attention span to get past the summary for policymakers and get into the nuts and bolts of this stuff and understand the jargon. And you can see it does not at all support what like the media headlines are telling you. And I'm saying that, and it's not so much that I'm blaming the media, because I can kind of see any individual sort of evolving in this milieu of the information, they would just naturally take it in stride. So I don't know who's to blame for it, but the point is there is this chasm between what the science actually says, if you include with that the, like analysis of government policies, like how should people respond to this given these facts or, these tendencies concerning natural science relationships. Okay, so just for those who don't know the elements of the Green New Deal, which is the focus of today's talk. So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is a rising figure in US politics, for those who are from other countries, I'm not sure how big a deal she has had on your news cycle, but here, so she was newly elected in the previous midterm elections, and is just having a lot of impact on the political discussion, far out of proportion to what you would have normally thought. And one of her signature issues is the so-called Green New Deal. So she didn't invent that phrase. I looked at before the talk here. I think Thomas Friedman used it as early as 2007 or 2008. I'm not sure if he coined it, but so this idea has been going around. So obviously what it's alluding to is the New Deal of the United States in the 1930s. So the Franklin Roosevelt's administrations, they were implementing what they called the New Deal. And it was a whole series of interventions, regulations in the market, but also involved a lot of big spending programs. And so in standard, US history that you would learn in grade school, especially if you went to a government school, it would be, you'd learn, oh yes, the US tried laissez-faire. There was the stock market crash in '29. Herbert Hoover was this, ideological, do-nothing, laissez-faire president. Didn't do anything. We had the worst economy in US history. Then, thank goodness, the American people came to their senses, elected FDR, he implemented the New Deal, and that got us out of the Depression. All right, so that's stuff you would learn in a standard setting, which of course others and I at Mises U have shown that that history is wrong, both in terms of just the theory and the standard historical figures. But that's the context for which AOC, so AOC stands for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is trying to link this new aggressive program to something that a lot of American progressives would have thought, ah, yes, that was back when we solved a problem back then that was huge. We now face a similar problem, the climate crisis, and so they're trying to link those two together. Okay, so just to give you an idea of the language involved here. So as we go through the talk, I'll give you more specifics about the things they want to do, because I'll show you like the cost estimates. So rather than me spend too much time here summarizing it, I'll just give you a spirit of the flavor. So this is from the draft legislation that they released in December of 2018. And it was saying that they want to have this committee to establish a Green New Deal that would have authority to develop a detailed national industrial economic mobilization plan. Okay, so you can see that part of what they're doing is they're saying we can't think small, we have to be big and bold. That's successful, politically. Like they're saying, hey, back during the New Deal, FDR didn't shy away from doing something radical, even though people said he was a socialist. He went ahead and did what was necessary. And they're saying, in our time now, the climate crisis is serious. And this is kind of like how Cortez sort of pushes against some of the older people in the Democratic Party, including Nancy Pelosi. She's saying that, we've tried their compromise approach, their play nice politics. They want to do a little carbon tax, and the time for that is beyond us. That we have, and she actually says, I'm not putting words in her mouth. She has said we have 12 years to act, and that's what the UN's telling us. We have 12 years to turn this around, or it's over. We missed the window. Okay, and so we have to do big, bold programs. And on top of all that, they say this will address all these other social and economic problems with the United States, right? So they have all sorts of stuff in this document involving like gender imbalance and stuff like that, okay? So this is all, so you can see where they're coming from. They're saying we have this big, bold plan, and they're saying not only do we need this in terms of the science, but it will sell politically, right? People get excited about some big, bold program like a Green New Deal, whereas something like, oh, let's have a carbon tax set to the social cost of carbon to deal with a negative externality, that puts people to sleep. They don't want that. And another thing, too, that they say, and she's probably right politically, is let's stress, instead of having the broccoli and the vegetables, why don't we give them the good stuff, okay? That people like spending programs. They don't want to hear that you're putting in a tax that will make gasoline more expensive, and that's what a carbon tax does. So they don't really focus in the Green New Deal on that stuff. They sort of mention as an aside, oh yeah, sure, we'll tax stuff, don't worry. And that's, I don't think there was any doubt of that. But their point is, no, what we're focusing on is like spending $1 trillion plus on new infrastructure, like to refit buildings in the United States with better insulation, that kind of stuff, all right? So that's where they're coming from. Yep, so it calls for spending at least $1 trillion over 10 years. And, they have different language, but the idea is they want to get the U.S. down to net zero emissions. And so that phrase net zero means like there's still going to be things that emit carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the U.S. 10 years from now or 12 years from now, but they're going to take other measures to compensate for that, like planting trees or doing other things that suck carbon out. So they're saying on net. And this is where, as an aside, if you've heard somebody on one of the FAQs that was up originally, so the frequently asked questions, one of the ones that they had, the hypothetical questioner who's reading, their version of the draft language for a hypothetical Green New Deal, they have people say, why are you going for net zero emissions as opposed to, just zero emissions, period? And that's where they said the infamous thing of, I'm paraphrasing here, but this language was in there saying something like, well, because we realize in a decade that's not enough time to completely get rid of airplanes and farting cows, all right? And so that's why a bunch of Republicans then, and people like Rush Limbaugh were going around saying AOC wants to ban hamburgers, right? And then, of course, people like Paul Krugman say, oh, that's a dirty, rotten lie. And to prove it was a lie, they're saying that was put up that wasn't intended for public consumption. The public wasn't supposed to see that, and they took it right down once people started flipping out. which, you know, you can imagine in other contexts, like if, you know, some Republicans had put up something saying we're trying to, well, we can't get rid of all abortions in 10 years, so that's what, I don't think Planned Parenthood would say, well, they took it down. They probably don't really have anything, you know, that's, okay, so again, that stuff was not a straw man. That was in the FAQ that somebody on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's staff, they posted publicly, and then when people started flipping out, that's when they took it off, right? And there was other things too that I won't dwell on in the original version they put up about like people, there was a line in there about how they're gonna have a job guarantee for those unable or unwilling to work. And so some people were a bit concerned, what do you mean the unwilling to work? And so they took that down and they go, oh, that's a dirty Republican lie. Just because we put something up there, you're, you know, quoting us? Come on, is that what we come down to, quoting? All right. Okay, so here's some problems with the Green New Deal. Obviously, we could dwell on any one of these, but just to go through it quickly. So one thing, and again, and this just shows you how, I don't know, like to use the language that the left often used, how in bad faith these arguments are, where you don't take them seriously. The word nuclear did not appear in the original draft legislation, and then later, because people were asking about it, they clarified and said, yes, we will not expand nuclear power at all in this, all right? So again, if you really thought that, you know, our grandchildren's fate depended on us drastically reducing carbon dioxide emissions within the next 10 to 15 years, then the only hope you would have of doing that would be to drastically expand electricity production from nuclear, right? Because that's zero emission. And yet they don't want to do that, and for obvious reasons, because nuclear power for a long time has been a boogeyman to people on the left. And so, you know, why would they expand it? What they want are so-called renewables. Wind and solar are their babies, okay? And in some settings, they also support hydro. And by the way, that's another example of this, just to show you why, you know, I don't believe the surface rhetoric that there's these things called renewable portfolio standards for U.S. states where they're going to generate a certain percentage of their electricity from so-called renewable sources. And in those states where hydro, you know, water or electricity coming from water power, actually makes economic sense, then hydro does not count towards fulfilling those requirements, right? No, it's got to be wind or solar. And so it's, you know, really it comes down to, it's not so much that they want the utilities to demonstrate to them, no, we're generating stuff from renewable power just like you want, because, you know, hydro's renewable. It's that they have to do something that's uneconomic, right, to show that they're engaging in sacrifice. If it made economic sense for a particular region to have a lot of power from hydro, they don't get patted on the head, oh, okay, you're part of the solution. That just doesn't count because, oh, well, you're just doing that because it's the profit motive, all right? So again, it's showing that this stuff is rolled up into the broader, let's call it agenda or vision of a good society, of a typical progressive leftist who's hostile towards capitalism, and you see that just shining through with all this stuff. Okay, another problem with this, again, even if you were a Keynesian like Paul Krugman, we don't need a New Deal right now. Okay, so even if you thought the original New Deal did solve the problem of the Great Depression and got rid of double-digit unemployment and so on, and the infrastructure was a great way to create jobs, boost aggregate demand, even if you bought all of that hook, line, and sinker, it still would not follow that right now we need a Green New Deal, right? Because according to any conventional measure, the labor market is certainly not in need of a massive fiscal stimulus right now, okay? And the Fed has been tightening, so the very least you'd say first, the Fed should cut interest rates back down to zero, and only then would you consider, right? So my point being, this doesn't even make sense even if you were a standard Keynesian, let alone if you're an Austrian. Okay, another problem with this stuff, again, just taking it prima facie face value here, even on its own terms, it has a laundry list of various goals and programs of, you know, things they want to achieve with this Green New Deal, and they're internally inconsistent. And so just one example of what I mean here is that part of what they want to do is retrofit every building in the United States to make it, you know, more energy efficient and so on. All right, and when I say every building, I'm not exaggerating. Like, they really have language in there to suggest that they mean every building needs to be, you know, considered for this and upgraded if necessary. At the other hand, another of their goals is to rapidly move toward, again, net zero emissions, at least from the electricity sector. Okay, and so if you think about it, though, those two goals don't make sense. If you achieved the latter goal, right, if you got it so that the electricity used in the United States was derived from sources that didn't emit greenhouse gases, to produce that electricity, then it doesn't matter whether your buildings are energy efficient or not, right? Because the reason you want to have energy efficient buildings in this context is because then you don't need to use as much electricity, for your heating or your air conditioning, depending on what season it is. And so then you don't need the coal-fired or the natural gas-fired power plant to produce as much electricity. Okay, but so you see the problem there, that if they actually did achieve the one goal, then the other one is unnecessary. But just to even think like that is so alien to the, you know what I mean? That to think like that makes it sound like they actually have some specific thing they want to do, and they're trying to use the best least cost means to achieve that. And that's not really what's going on here. I think that the list itself of things is its own goal, and that's why it's actually kind of naive and silly, missing the point to ask, well, wait a minute, will these things achieve this alleged climate goal that they want? That's not really the issue, all right? And this is just another example of that. Okay, so as I've been alluding to here, obviously when you read the whole list of things they want to do here, this climate crisis is just a pretext for all sorts of things that people on the progressive left, who are typically hostile towards capitalism, have been clamoring for decades. All right, it's, again, they want things like the Green New Deal, among other things that it's going to achieve, that they talk about explicitly in the draft legislation and in the FAQs and so on in the discussion. It's not just about, oh, we're going to solve the climate crisis and make sure that we restrict, atmospheric levels of CO2 to such and such targets. It's much more than that. It's things like restoring gender parity in labor markets and making sure that we, don't discriminate against indigenous peoples and things like that, right? So it's all sorts of interesting language in there that, again, sounds odd for a document that's talking about this alleged particular natural science crisis that, we have to do some quick technological fix for. To give an example of what I mean, so in this list of the attributes describing what they're going to do in the Green New Deal, they have this one clause in there saying, for anything they're going to propose, they're going to obtain the free, prior, and informed consent from indigenous peoples. Okay? And so that sounds great, but again, the context is they're saying humanity is on the verge of an existential threat. And so my point was, why are we going to let indigenous peoples ruin the planet? Right? I mean, that's what it comes down to. We're going to let indigenous people hold the rest of humanity hostage. That's great. Or to flip it the other way, they certainly did not get the free, prior, and informed consent from shareholders of coal-fired power plants before ruining their way of life, right? So again, and it's not even just a cutesy thing about, well, okay, native peoples versus a big business. Even when it comes to other people living around the world, part of what they're doing in this thing, to the extent they're going to have a carbon tax, is they would have what's called border adjustments. And so the idea is, if the U.S. taxes items here based on their carbon content, well, then there's a concern that if China doesn't follow suit and they're not taxing their stuff, well, then people could export stuff from China into the U.S. more cheaply because they're not getting dinged with a carbon tax. And so then at the border, we would compensate, right? So anything coming into the U.S. from a country that doesn't have a carbon tax or doesn't have high enough of a carbon tax, the U.S. would put in a quasi-tariff to account for that. Okay, so again, it's, just think that through. So they're gonna use coercion to influence what other people do in terms of their government policies, right? Because obviously the whole point of that is to encourage other governments to likewise levy a carbon tax in their own jurisdictions and not think that they're gonna be able to get an export advantage to the US or Europe or wherever because they're not taxing carbon and doing the responsible thing. So again, using our political system to lean on other peoples to get them to do what they want, right? So in other contexts, to interfere with other people's elections is a no-no, but it's okay, if the US government influences other people's government policies because, it's in the name of fighting climate change, right? So again, this stuff about obtaining free, prior, and informed consent, obviously the real thing there is typically someone on the progressive left is very concerned about indigenous peoples, whereas they don't care about big business, or they don't necessarily care about the people in China and what their government might be doing. Okay, so let me give you a cost estimate of some components of the Green New Deal. So this comes from the American Action Forum, And there's some huge numbers here, admittedly, right? So the bottom line here is a 10-year total cost of $93 trillion. And let me concede to you, when I first saw that, and, and this thing was making the rounds, so like right-leaning think tanks and media organizations that typically are against Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, obviously they pounced on this and they were distributing it and it was making the rounds. And when I first saw it, I thought, okay, I bet you they're stretching at points to come up with such a big number, because how could it be? And no, they're not, all right? I went through the thing, again, I was skeptical at first, and I went through it, and they explained, how they came up with these calculations, and it is very conservative. And I'll give you an example when I hit one of them as to, some of the assumptions they made that would underplay what it is. So don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying if some version of the Green New Deal passed, it would actually mean, in fact, there'd be a 10-year cost of $93 trillion, because that's crazy. They wouldn't do something so ludicrously expensive. What it means is the actual language so far of the Green New Deal is just crazy. I mean, they might as well just say, we're going to give everyone a unicorn, right? And then some horse society, equestrian society would come along and come up with an estimate of infinity, and we'd say, okay, it's not that it's really going to be infinitely costly, it's that they're not going to give everybody a unicorn. That's what's going to happen in practice. Okay, so likewise with this stuff, the U.S. is not going to go to net zero emissions in 10 years. That's just not going to happen, no matter what anybody does. Okay, and so it's things like that. So what I'm just kind of showing you here, I'm not predicting this is how much it will cost if some version passes. I'm just saying if you actually took them seriously and went through and started quantifying what some of this would mean in practice, the numbers just blow up really fast. So again, underlying how crazy and pie in the sky this stuff is. Okay, so one thing is a low carbon electricity grid, 5.4 trillion, great. Net zero emissions, again, so this stuff, it's not worth getting into the mechanics here in this talk. You can, go Google that American Action Forum's estimate if you want to see how they came up with it. But let me draw your attention to, you see where some of these big numbers come from, is like the job guarantee. So that's the third one down, this one right here. So that's kind of a wide margin, isn't it? 6.8 trillion to 44.6 trillion. So the reason it's such a wide range there for the cost estimate is because they're just showing under different assumptions as to what exactly are we going to do here when you say a job guarantee. Because part of the issue is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other proponents of the Green New Deal were rather vague about the specifics. And so to come up with some of these numbers, the authors of this cost estimate kind of just had to say, well, maybe they mean this, in which case, that's the way it went. And again, they were not reaching and putting words in their mouth. They were just taking the plain language and then trying to show in practice what would this mean. So for this job guarantee, where they came up with it is they said, all right, I think it was something like $600 a week, something like that. So it was a reasonable figure to show, what would be a job guarantee would mean. So they were, going to other proponents of a job guarantee to come up with some of these numbers. And then they were saying, okay, if we look at like right now at the unemployment rate for people who are underemployed for economic reasons, right? So not necessarily someone who's literally unemployed, but someone who's not working a full-time job because of economic reasons. So that's a specific classification. And they said all those people presumably would want to take the government guaranteed job, which pays more, in terms of how much you get from a 40-hour work week. And so that they multiply those numbers there. So they figure out how many people in America right now would clearly prefer to get the job guarantee versus what they're doing right now, and they came up with that. And that's on the lower end. But then they started saying, okay, well also, what if there's people who are working full-time, but they're in a job that pays less than what the federal job guarantee would be? Presumably they would all switch over, right? So that's how they got the number bigger. And then they went even further and said, okay, what if there's people who are working at a miserable job for 40 hours a week, and technically they're making a little bit more in take-home pay than they would get from the job guarantee, but the thing with the job guarantee is you don't have to work. And so presumably a lot of people, even who right now are making a little bit more, would rather get the job guarantee and not work at all rather than having this thing, right? So they started just going through and running the numbers to try to see how much this job guarantee would cost, and that's what gave you the wide spectrum there. And I think so they weren't making any assumptions beyond that, right? So otherwise it was just simple arithmetic, and the reason it blows up so fast is just because, well, the job guarantee is a big number. In order for it to truly be able to replace a job, it's got to be a decent number, and then times however many million people you have doing it over the course of 10 years, that's where they come up with these numbers. Beyond that, though, it's also, I think they're understating it because they weren't doing a feedback effect, right? They weren't saying as we expand and more of the population just stops working and now gets this job guarantee, and so now they effectively have the purchasing power as if they have a full-time job. Well, clearly over time, something has to give, right? So if you all of a sudden say 20 million people who right now aren't working or are working very little are gonna now have the income equivalent as if they have a full-time, good-paying job, and they start going and buying stuff with it, okay, so unless you're a Keynesian who thinks that we had, artificially high unemployment, but for anyone else, whether you're a classical economist or an Austrian, obviously if a huge portion of the population now is consuming that wasn't before, and you haven't made society more productive just by giving these people purchasing power, that means the amount available for everybody else has to go down, all right, just in terms of simple arithmetic. So if you think it through, no matter how they finance it, whether they run the printing press or borrow money or tax, clearly per capita, your real after-tax plus taking into account inflation, wage rate has to go down if you're one of the shrinking number of people who are still working in conventional jobs after they put this into effect. And so if the government's given this guarantee for anybody, whether you work or not, and now the amount you get, all things considered, from your regular job keeps getting worse, even more people were going to switch over, okay? And so that's something that they didn't model that in here. They were assuming that everybody else's job would stay the same. Okay, again, universal health care, $36 trillion. That's not an unreasonable estimate. Even proponents of universal health care, come up with numbers like that, and the question is, how can we pay for it? And they talk about different things. So again, these numbers are not pie in the sky whatsoever. They walk through and show you how they came up with it. And this is just a few of the things that are in the Green New Deal. Okay, so what about this issue of, do we really have 12 years to solve climate change? And I should say, Ocasio-Cortez herself kind of admitted that she was just bluffing on that. Okay, I don't have the tweet, I didn't have it in here, but later she said something along the lines of, oh, and people who take the rhetoric about 12 years left literally at face value, that they really they need a lobotomy, or she said something like that, or their brain. She said some put down. It might not have been that exact one. Sort of like, rolling her eyes, oh, and these GOP people, when I said we had 12 years left to act and that's what the UN told us, they actually thought I meant that literally, go figure. And so I promise I'm not that's the way she played it when people were like going to the UN documents saying, no, actually it doesn't say that. And then she was acting like, oh, come on, you thought I was serious? So, and again, you can go see her, she's talking with, sincerity and earnestness in front of this live audience where she originally said this thing about 12 years left. Okay, but for those who just want to see it definitively, let me show you that, again, this isn't even close. So this is coming from the UN's own documents, right? So it takes a while to learn how to read this stuff, but once you do, it's pretty straightforward. And so where I got this from was it's called the AR5. That's the most recent of these periodic updates that the UN publishes, summarizing the state of both the natural science, but also things talking about what they call mitigation factors, right? So different policies the government could do to help mitigate the impact of climate change, things that slow the rate of emissions relative to what otherwise would happen, and so that slows harmful climate change, and that's the idea. So this is from their own document. Let me there's a lot going on here. What it's talking about, what is this? It's the increase in the mid and long-term mitigation cost due to delayed additional mitigation up to 2030. Okay, so what this chart is showing you is to say, what if governments around the world did nothing until the year 2030, and then they began aggressively putting in place measures to try to hit various types of climate change targets? Okay, so that's what this is talking about. And what I just want to show you is the biggest number in the whole chart, the whole table, is this 44%. And that's showing between the years 2030 to 2050, if governments around the world did nothing until 2030 and only then began, their aggressive measures, the cost of achieving, and these are the targets over here. So the particulars don't matter so much. I just want to show you the big picture. They're saying, oh, it'd be 44% more expensive to achieve those various climate change goals if we procrastinate, if we don't do anything until 2030. And then in the long run, from 2050 to 2100, that worst case number drops to 37%. Because these ones, this top row, those are more aggressive climate change measures. The bottom row, it's less aggressive. So the more stringent the climate target that we want to have, like how much warming or how much atmospheric concentration of CO2 by the year 2100 is the goal, the costlier it is if we twiddle our thumbs until the year 2030. That's what they're trying to present here. But notice there's not infinity signs, or there's not an asterisk that you go read and says we're all dead so it doesn't matter, right? So, and also the rhetorical point of this table, these people, you know, they're for a carbon tax. They're for these so-called mitigation measures. They are trying to use this to show the reader, let's not listen to those counseling delay or those saying, let's wait for more data to come in because we have uncertainty. They're saying we need to act now because look at, if we don't act, for example, if we wait until 2030, it's going to cost 44% more. Okay, but you see the problem is they painted themselves into a corner rhetorically because they've got other people saying if we don't act, so notice 2018 to 2030 is 12 years, the way that works out. You've got other people like Ocasio-Cortez saying, oh, the UN's telling us we're all dead or our grandchildren are doomed if we don't act, if we don't solve this problem by 2030. Here they're just showing you if we did nothing and just got started on solving it in the year 2030, oh, it would cost 44% more. And you might say, okay, but you know, is the original baseline cost some huge thing? And then, well, again, the proponents of this painted themselves into a corner. That Paul Krugman, for example, has said repeatedly in his columns that the cost of achieving all of these renewable goals and so forth is relatively low because, hey, wind and solar, they just keep getting more and more efficient all the time. Pretty soon, that, you know, even without government measures, they're going to break even with conventional technologies. And so it's going to be, in some of his columns, he goes so far as to say the cost might be negative, by which he's saying it actually would benefit us from doing it. And that sort of makes you wonder, well, then why does the government need to force it? But again, that's his own terminology. So it's the cost, if we act now, of dealing with hitting all these things and saving the planet is close to zero or possibly negative. And if we wait until 2030, oh, it's going to be 44% more. So I don't know what 44% more of basically nothing is, but it's not, we're all dead. Okay, so again, you see what I'm saying, that the rhetoric here is completely out of bounds, and you see how they've painted themselves into a corner, where on the one hand, they want to scare everyone and say, we need to act and take all these aggressive measures right away or our grandchildren are doomed. And then some people say, okay, but you're talking about revamping society. That sounds like it's going to be expensive. They say, no, don't worry, it won't be. Okay, and so it's kind of hard to have it both ways. If it's going to be relatively painless because wind and solar are going to be so efficient just around the corner that it's not going to be that hard to switch over, well, then the market would switch over anyway. All right, historically, people switched away from horse and buggy to the automobile, and it wasn't because there was a manure tax, right? People just naturally switched over. So if it is the case that it makes sense to people to drive electric cars, they'll do that automatically, right? You don't need the government to have a huge carbon tax to force people to do it, unless it really doesn't make economic sense, okay? In which case it will be painful to switch over. So again, they're trying to have it both ways, or at least a lot of them in this debate are doing that. Okay, there's a few other fun things here. So how do progressives claim that a Green New Deal will make us happier? So I like this because occasionally, the mask slips, or some of them don't realize what arguments other people on their side of the debate are making to the public. So I liked this article in The Intercept. It says, the one I highlighted here, it says, Fremst and Paul find that people who work less also emit less carbon dioxide. And the punchline here is a novel. This economist so-and-so drawing connection between work hours and climate change for well over a decade, how Americans have come to work more and what effect that has on how people spend their dwindling leisure time. Okay, so in case you don't get it, the big picture here is the way the Green New Deal will make us happier is because it's going to reduce economic growth. People aren't going to work as much in the new equilibrium once all these policies are in place. People are going to go to work less. They're going to refrain from working so much. Businesses won't produce as much stuff. Real GDP will be lower than it otherwise would have been, and we'll be happier because we'll have less consumerism. Okay, and so that may, you can make that argument, but I do appreciate the honesty of it, right? So it's kind of like, for those familiar with it, originally the socialists said, oh, let's have socialism. will produce more for the masses than capitalism will. And then people saw what a disaster socialist countries were and how people were starving. And then the claim was, let's adopt socialism because we won't have crass consumerism the way those capitalists do, right? And so that's what they're doing here, that they're sort of admitting, okay, yes, output will be lower conventionally measured, but we'll be happier. Incidentally, I'm fine with that. Like if somebody wants to say, you know what, US culture stresses consumerism too much, and if everybody worked 10% less and, you know, and didn't buy so much stuff and had smaller houses, they'd be happier. I'm certainly open to that argument, and that's fine, but you don't achieve that by forcing it on them, right? What you would do is you would voluntarily persuade them, don't work as much, okay? You wouldn't make them better off. It's like if you took away all the forklifts, you know, that would reduce output, but that wouldn't therefore make us happier, right? Even if it were true that we're working too much right now, and you know, all things considered in a paternalistic sense. Okay, what is the best evidence I can give you? So again, what I'm sitting here telling you is, it's not merely the Austrians and other radical free market economists who know that the claims made in support of the Green New Deal can't be right. It's conventional economics that's saying this. The best example I have of this, by the way, let me say this before I forget, is William Nordhaus, back in the fall, won the Nobel Prize, he was a co-winner of the Nobel Prize for his pioneering work on the economics of climate change. The same weekend that announcement came out, the UN issued a special report advising governments on how to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Some newspaper stories, like in the New York Times, talked about both things in the same article, saying, William Nordhaus wins his work on climate change, raising awareness, da, da, da. At the same time, the UN, showing the urgency of the situation. You would have no idea that William Nordhaus's work shows that trying to achieve a 1.5C target would be disastrous and would be worse than doing nothing, okay? And yet, that's the situation. The guy who wins the Nobel Prize for his work on climate change, his own work shows the UN target's crazy, is nuts, and it would be better just to have unrestricted climate change than to do that, such a crazy target. And yet, it's the same time that, his article, his work, his Nobel Prize gets covered in the same story, and nobody in the media even knows to ask that. So again, I'm not mad at them. I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think they just don't know. And the one time where he did have a chance to clarify, and I really think less of him because of this, because up till that point I just thought, okay, well, he doesn't want to rock the boat or something, but technically he's not saying anything wrong. He could say, hey, my work speaks for itself. But somebody for the New York Times, I think it was Coral Davenport, when she was interviewing him the week after he won, and talking about, and one of the questions near the end of the interview was, do we still have time to hit the 1.5C target? And Nordhaus just said, no, I don't think we have time left to do that. I think that's unrealistic. I think we're going to hit that. And that's how he stopped. He didn't say, and thank God, right? So he didn't let anybody know that that would be a terrible target, or that is a terrible target, and we shouldn't be trying to hit it. So I just, again, showing you the dichotomy of this. So here, in case you're skeptical and think, come on, Bob, how can you be, saying this? We know how mainstream economics surely is supporting this stuff. This is the best evidence I've come up with thus far to show you that no, standard economic theory, whether it's mainstream economics that Paul Samuelson and William Nordhaus would endorse, or even Paul Krugman in terms of the standard models that he would believe in, stuff the Obama administration puts out, does not support the Green New Deal. I don't know if you can read that in the back, but this is an editorial from The Guardian. And it says, the Guardian view on a Green New Deal, we need it now. And the subtitle was, policymakers ought not wait for economic theory to catch up with the environmental crisis. All right, and so when I saw this, I wrote an article saying economists need to stop being useful idiots for the green socialists. Okay, and so there I was alluding to, there's controversy over whether this was actually a thing, but in US right-wing circles for a while, back in the 50s and 60s, a useful idiot was somebody that was helping the Soviet Union achieve their agenda unwittingly, right? Like they didn't realize they were being used by the Soviets. So the idea was that the Soviets, the commies referred to these people as useful idiots in the West, okay? And so I'm saying here, economists who are publishing their papers on carbon tax, and if we use the revenue to do such and such and reduce corporate income tax, we could get a win-win. That they're being used by radical environmentalists. They don't care about what their economic theory says, right? So if they say, oh, yes, there's a mild market failure and we should have a modest carbon tax, it's not that the green socialists are going to say, oh, wait a minute, carbon tax is $30 a ton and that's it, because we wouldn't want to, move away from the Pareto optimum. That's not what they're talking about. If they think capitalism is evil for, oppressing women and indigenous people, they're not looking at, what Pagoo said about fixing a market failure. All right, and so this is what I'm trying to show. And again, so the people who are more sophisticated, they can't stand the work of William Nordhaus because they recognize correctly that using regular economic theory, even with all the market failure stuff and saying, yes, people who drive don't take into account carbon dioxide emissions and how they're imposing cost, you can't get the radical prescription and agenda of what the Green New Deal is calling for. It doesn't make sense even on its own terms. And that's what, this article is confirming. Okay, so let me now, I just got a minute and a half here left. Let me just show you some of the ways that things are getting better. And even the UN's own documents show it. All right, so this is something coming from, again, the latest report from the UN on climate change issues. I know it's going to be hard for you to see in the back here. What this is talking about is the number of undernourished children below age 5 in both 2000 and 2050. Okay, so the 2000 is a real figure, the 2050 figure is obviously an estimate. And so you can see they estimated that in the year 2000, there were about 148 million undernourished children age 5 or younger. In the year 2050, what if there's no climate change? That number is going to drop to 113 million, right? So a big reduction. But now what does the UN say in the year 2050? If there is climate change, 138.5 million. Okay, so yes, it's higher than the counterfactual where there's no climate change. So there's a sense in which climate change might cause there to be 20 million more undernourished children, and that's a bad thing, other things equal. Obviously, you don't want that. But it's still better than what it was in the year 2000. And this is, you can do this with just about every figure, in this debate, that what they're ultimately talking about, they're doing things like saying, oh, in the year 2100, under pretty pessimistic scenarios, meaning where humanity releases a lot of carbon dioxide, other greenhouse gases, and the Earth's climate system is particularly sensitive to those emissions in terms of how much warming they will yield. And you get pessimistic on the damage estimates from, well, that much extra warming, how much damage will it cause humanity? Even so, it's like a real bad scenario. Oh, maybe GDP in the year 2100 is 9% lower than it otherwise would be. So yeah, prima facie, a 9% hit to global GDP, that's humongous. But when you couch it in terms of what's going to be in the year 2100, what that really means is, oh, the standard of living that humanity would have achieved in the year 2100, which they're going to be, and so instead of being like 4 times richer than we are, they'll only be 3.8 times richer, right? Or I've seen other people do the calculations where without climate change, if that just weren't a thing, if the laws of physics were different or whatever, then the standard of living humanity would have in the year 2100, now because of climate change, shoot, they got to wait to the year 2102 in order to get that level of per capita standard of living. You see what I'm saying? So this is, again, these are the conventional figures. This is stipulating, for the sake of argument, all the standard relationships that are published in the UN documents. So I'm not up here denying climate change. I am denying the interpretation that's being given to the UN's own documents. Okay, let me just show you one last one here. So again, this is based on standard data. This is age standardized death rate by cause, and you can see it starts at 1990, right? So I'm not like showing since the time of Charles Dickens. I'm showing from 1990. Look at how drastically death rates around the world, including from communicable diseases, have come down. This is when we've allegedly been hit with the ravages of climate change, such that only, people in the pay of big oil could possibly deny, and you can see these improvements. Okay, so again, this is kind of the standard response I would give, to the extent that this is true and that there are going to be, certain problems arising from it, and maybe there will be, that's an empirical question. The way to deal with it is by having relatively unfettered capitalism. People create wealth and they deal with problems, and that's the way you would respond to this stuff. Okay, that's my time. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, it looks like about 3 o'clock. It's going about 3 o'clock. You're probably tired from lunch, but here we are in the wolf room, so why don't we all let out a big old wolf howl to, a wolf howl to wake everybody up. I'm a golf fan. I've been a golfer my whole life, and the last tournament, the last PGA tournament, there's a young guy, 20 years old, dropped out of Oklahoma State, became a pro golfer and won this first tournament, and his name is Michael Wolff. And already he has fans, and when he approaches the green, they all howl. You hear the howling like a wolf. Anyway, so if you're a sports fan, it's kind of a silly thing. So anyway, the wolf is one of my favorite animals. I like watching shows on wolves. Okay, I don't know why that is. It's one of my sicknesses. Okay, market failure. What I'm going to talk about today is sort of a little bit of history of economic thought, I guess. I'll just give you a little bit of background about the economics of market failure. Those of you who have taken economics, you read through the chapters of a textbook on externalities, public goods, monopoly, all the standard examples of market failure. And there was a huge literature that came up, relatively new in the scheme of things, really beginning in the 1930s and 40s, because that's when the so-called perfect competition model was developed. Prior to that, just about anybody who wrote anything about economics and competition and industry pretty much followed what the Austrians were saying about competition being a dynamic, rivalrous process of entrepreneurship, the common sense ideas about what competition is. It involves price cutting and product differentiation and mergers, and the markets are constantly dynamic, and businesses are constantly changing tactics, changing strategies, changing products, changing prices to see what works best. So the market evolves to tell us what works best, and that's how businesses find out what works best and what price to charge and so forth. But then in this sort of the crusade to create an economic science and the mathematization of economics, it was decided that the old ways of thinking about markets were inadequate. We needed a new theory, so they developed the theory of perfect competition. And like I said, in the scheme of things, it's relatively recent. It's 80 or 90 years old as far as that goes, and in terms of the history of economic thought. And so Peter Klein probably talked about some of this, but the new definition of competition involved a number of assumptions about what a perfect market would look like: homogeneous products, homogeneous prices, many firms, and costless entry and exit. Perfect information was also in there. I'll just call that omniscience. So all of a sudden, the markets did not change in the 1930s. Markets were markets. The normal ups and downs of markets, or the 1940s. But all of a sudden, homogeneous products. If the New England Patriots adopt a slightly different defense than the Atlanta Falcons, well, that's product differentiation. That's an imperfect market in professional football, or pick your industry. You have a sale. Well, that's not a homogeneous. You're not charging the same price as everyone else anymore. That's market failure. Costless entry and exit. Well, that guarantees that the prices will stay at this same level. Price equal the minimum of average cost, because if you raise your price 1 penny, 10,000 firms will costlessly enter immediately and drop the price back down that 1 penny. And then, of course, you're omniscient. You know exactly how to produce the cost minimizing combination of inputs and everything else. Consumers know exactly what they want. And as Friedrich Hayek said in his famous essay, The Meaning of Competition, which is online, he said, under perfect competition, there is no competition. So they pretty much, so the economics profession, though, took this seriously and made recommendation after recommendation for government regulation of all sorts to deal with this problem all of a sudden that existed that economists didn't think it did exist for, many generations before that. And what that, the rubric that goes under is the nirvana fallacy. Nirvana fallacy. And the nirvana fallacy is a phrase that was coined, probably it was coined by an economist named Harold Demsetz. That's spelled Demsetz. He wrote an article in the Journal of Law and Economics in, I think it was 1969. It was called Information and Efficiency, Another Viewpoint. I found it online at some point, so it's online somewhere. Harold Demsetz. And he was in a debate at the time in the journals with Kenneth Arrow, who was a Nobel Prize winning economist and a famous market failure theorist. And the reason he used this phrase, nirvana fallacy, is he's saying that, well, the method of analysis of the mainstream economics profession was to set up this unrealistic, unobtainable utopian ideal called perfect competition, and then compare that to the real world, and then announce that the real world is a failure, and that perfect government must step in and perfectly solve the problem of market failure in some way. And so there's sort of double dishonesty there. One is it's totally a straw man argument. Set up a straw man, perfect competition, and look around the world and say, oh, I don't see perfection out there. And then part two is, but I'm looking at Washington, D.C. in the distance, and I see perfection. I see nirvana. I see politicians and bureaucrats, and they will perfectly solve the problem, and that's basically the method of analysis of the market failure theory. And when I was just getting out of graduate school, when I got out of graduate school, when I started my career, I remember having a colleague at George Mason who was very prolific. He's publishing like mad in all these highly mathematical journals, because his dissertation was one big mathematical model of market failure, and he would just add another tiny little different assumption, a slightly different assumption, and then churn through all the math again, and he would get yet another article in the International Review of International Trade or something like this, and he's like a dozen a year like this. And so if you look at the literature, you think, oh my God, the markets are rotten, they're failure everywhere, but and this was why. And that's why, by the way, the whole field of public choice came along to say, now hold on a minute, the governments are not perfect. And they pretty much accepted. They said even if you accept all this market failure literature, then you can't assume the government will make the problem better, it might make it worse. But that's sort of I'm getting off my topic a little bit. And so what I wrote down here, so that's what the nirvana fallacy is. And what I wrote down here is how to make markets fail, quote, fail, or how to declare markets being failing. Nirvana fallacy, step one, ignore the fact that markets are dynamic. So if there's some sort of problem or issue and you don't like how markets are operating, well, give them time. The markets aren't static, they change over time. And I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail. Also, you ignore entrepreneurship. Because if there's a perceived problem in a market, more often than not, there's money to be made by somebody by solving the problem. Human beings are problem solvers. That's what entrepreneurs do. And so you have to ignore entrepreneurship too, to guarantee that markets fail everywhere. And you also have to ignore reality. So a lot of these market failure theories that have made it into the textbooks are theories. And they're assumed as truth because they're theories. And this is especially true of the hyper-mathematical segment of the economics profession that comes from places like MIT and Harvard and Princeton and schools like that, where they have the extraordinarily elaborate mathematical models, and then not a single statistic or a bit of history or anything. They just assume that since the mathematical model they solved the mathematical model and got an equilibrium condition, that's God's truth. And that's not always true. That's not always true about these models. I can remember earlier in my career, I wrote a whole book, with sections of a book about the phenomenon of the fact that in the Congress, something like 90 to 95% of all incumbents have been reelected for the past 60 years. That's a true fact. Okay, I was at a meeting of the Public Choice Society, and a mathematical political scientist was there, and he had a very impressive looking mathematical model, and the conclusion of it was that incumbents will never be reelected. The government was perfectly competitive. And he was kind of laughing at me when I threw up the real statistics. He's kind of giggling about this. And, what planet am I living on? You have a choice, reality and BS. Oh, I'll pick the BS. It's better for my career to pick the BS. So what do I mean by all this? Well, an example, I'll give you one quick example of the nirvana fallacy in microeconomics that used to exist, not so much anymore. Yeah, it's on there. So, this is the old monopoly diagram from the textbooks, the marginal cost. The monopoly model says a monopolist will equate marginal revenue and marginal cost, produce QM, and charge PM as a price, whereas this would be the competitive price, and this would be the competitive output, QC, on there, because the marginal cost curve would be the supply curve, and here's demand right here, and so that would be the price. And so for years, there were economists criticizing product innovation and research and development and urging more government regulation and control of R&D and innovation because they thought it was leading to monopoly. That was that sort of thinking that led to the antitrust lawsuit against Microsoft. When was it, 15 or so years ago? But the argument they were making was that if you invent a new product, by definition, you're creating a monopoly, at least temporarily, before anybody gets there. And so you're restricting output. And so the standard analysis was that, that we should be leery of this. They're creating monopolies because the output restriction is said to be this amount here. A perfectly competitive market. If everybody had the same idea at the same time, then the market equilibrium would be QC right here. But they didn't. You did. You had the idea, and now you're a monopolist and you're producing QM. And so therefore, perhaps we should force Microsoft to share the code for Windows. That was a proposal that the government made back when they were suing Microsoft, publish that. Or maybe we should force Coca-Cola to publish the recipe for Coca-Cola, or the Kentucky Fried Chicken recipe. It's unfair that Colonel Sanders hogs it all, Kentucky Fried Chicken recipe. But what Harold Dempsey said, and would still say, still around, is that the appropriate comparison is the existing world today, which is right here, 0, to the existing world after your invention, which is QM. So by inventing the product, you have actually expanded outputs, or expanded production. You haven't restricted production. Because of course, if you compare nirvana, perfectly competitive equilibrium, QC, to something less, well, yeah, you denounce it as failure. But the real comparison is what we have today versus what we have tomorrow after your invention gets on the market. That's the real comparison. And so, to put aside the fact that the whole idea of output restriction is a bad thing, as Murray Rothbard pointed out in Man, Economy, and State, that even assuming that one industry does restrict output like this, well, all those resources don't just disappear, they're put to work somewhere else. And so there's going to be an expansion of output somewhere else. So you cannot say that there's been an output restriction in a global sense, because the economy is fluid and dynamic. Okay, so that's one example of the nirvana fallacy. And so what I thought I'd do is give you talk about some of the economics literature on market failure that I think illustrates what I just said here. It illustrates how to declare markets failing. I'm going to put that back up on the screen now. By a combination of all these things, the nirvana fallacy, ignoring the fact that markets are dynamic, ignoring entrepreneurship, and ignoring reality. Okay. One example, there's an article by Ronald Coase, who won the Nobel Prize in economics some years ago. He was never considered to be an Austrian economist, Although a lot of his research, and he was around a long time. I've read articles by Ronald Coase that he published in the 1930s, and he was still, 10 years ago, he was still publishing articles. And so shortly before he died, I think he lived to 105 or something like that. He lived a good long life. And it would have been consistent with a lot of research in Austrian economics, and it would have been, I'm pretty sure it would have been welcomed in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics, some of the things that he wrote. He was the editor of the Journal of Law and Economics for many years. Anyway, he took on this idea that in all the textbooks for many, many years, when they get to the section on the free rider problem and the public goods problem, and it's time to name an example, they would name the lighthouse as an example. The lighthouse would be an example. Here's what Paul Samuelson said in his famous textbook. Take our earlier case of a lighthouse to warn against the rocks, the ships, warning the ships against the rocks in the bay. Its beam helps everyone in sight, but a businessman could not build it for a profit since he cannot claim a price from each user. This certainly is the kind of activity that governments would naturally undertake. So he goes on and he gives a much more detailed explanation of why this is a classic example of the free rider problem, that you can't charge the next ship coming in the harbor for the light. Once the light is provided, the next ship to come along will just free ride on whoever paid for the light. And therefore, in advance, you could never get the merchants, the shippers, to pay for a lighthouse because of the free riding problem. They would all be motivated to say, let George do it. Let the other guy pay for it. I'm not going to pay. And if everybody thinks that way, then you end up not getting the so-called public good provided. Classic free rider problem. Well, Coase did something. He quotes Paul Samuel, the great Paul Samuelson. I think Samuelson won the first Nobel Prize in economics. He quotes Arthur Pigou. His name is also associated with the theory of externalities on this, and other famous economists in the history of economic thought is saying the same thing. And none of these great scholars did what Coase did. Coase got up off his butt and out of his swivel chair in his faculty office and went to the library. Imagine that. Imagine an economic theorist going to the library. And he read some books about lighthouses. What a pedestrian thing for a PhD to be doing, reading books. And lo and behold, he studied the British lighthouse system and found that for many generations there had been privately funded lighthouses. So that the shipping industry was not so stupid after all as Paul Samuelson thought. It's kind of like, so I'm not going to tell you the whole story. So he did this big long study with big lengthy quotations and all that, but he found out that it did exist. Okay, that the story told by the market failure theories did not match reality. And then he concludes by saying this: the question remains, how is it that these great men have in their economic writings been led to make statements about lighthouses which are misleading as to the facts, whose meaning, if thought about in a concrete fashion, is quite unclear, and which, to the extent that they imply a policy conclusion, are very likely wrong? And he goes on to say, the explanation is that these references by economists to lighthouses are not the result of their having made a study of lighthouses or having read a detailed study by some other economist. Despite the extensive use of the lighthouse example in the economics literature, no economist, to my knowledge, has ever made a comprehensive study of lighthouse finance and administration. The lighthouse is simply plucked out of the air to serve as an illustration. And you see that all the time in economics literature. And like I said, it's especially the math-obsessed model builders. They exhaust themselves with building these mathematical models, and then apparently they're too tired to pick up a book and see if reality matches the conclusion of their model, or at least go online nowadays. And one of the first book reviews I ever published when I got out of graduate school was in the Southern Economic Journal, and it was a book on innovation, on technological innovation. And one chapter had 57 equations, a model with 57 equations to come to the conclusion that the higher the expected return on an investment, the more money a corporation will want to put behind that investment. And I published that in the Southern Economic Journal, because that's a direct quote. It took 57 equations to come to that conclusion. Okay, that's the lighthouse. Another good example, famous example in the literature, is called The Fable of the Bees. And again, this is another example of market failure that was in almost all the microeconomics textbooks. And it's a situation of where you have a phenomenon of an apple orchard and bees, and bees could pollinate the apple trees so that the apple orchard owner will get more apples. And also, when the bees pollinate the apple trees, the bees get nourishment, and so the beekeeper will get more honey. So there's sort of a reciprocal positive externality there. And for years and years and years, this was given as an example in the textbooks of market failure under the assumption that there's no way that there would be any sort of payment of the beekeepers to have their bees near the apple orchard at the time when the blossoms come out, or the apple orchard owner wouldn't they wouldn't get together in any way and figure out how to benefit from this. And so therefore, these people said there's a need for government intervention to subsidize beekeeping. Okay, and I'll read you one thing here. And once again, another economist named Stephen Chung was from Hong Kong, and he was teaching at the University of Washington in Seattle at the time. And if you went to the nearest grocery store here in Auburn and bought apples this afternoon, you'd probably find some from Washington State, the big apple growing state. And so he was right there in the middle of it. And he also did the unthinkable. He got up off his butt and went to the library. Not only that, he went and interviewed beekeepers and apple orchard owners. Imagine that. I mean, went to school all those years to do that. You're supposed to sit in your office and play with math, is if you're an economist. And so so Stephen Chung quotes some other famous economists, Francis Bador. He wrote the book on market failure in the 1950s. If you went to graduate school in the 1950s and 60s and took a course in public finance, you read Francis Bador's book on market failure. He said this: "It's easy to show that if apple blossoms have a positive effect on honey production, any Pareto-efficient solution will associate with apple blossoms a positive Lagrangian shadow price." That's some math econ lingo. Don't worry about it. "If then apple producers are unable to protect their equity in apple nectar and markets do not impute to apple blossoms their correct shadow value, profit maximizing decisions will fail correctly to allocate resources." Market failure. "At the margin, there will be failure by enforcement." This is what I would call an ownership externality. So we invented a new type of externality, an ownership externality. There's no way that they could find out some financial arrangement to have the bees close to the apple orchard and so that both could benefit. And Stephen Chung and Coase sort of thought like an Austrian would think who has been studying entrepreneurship. Seems to me there's money to be made here. The bee keepers can make more money with more honey, and the apple orchard owner can make more money if he has bees pollinating his apple trees. And it's as though there's a $10,000 sitting here on this chair today, and it's also here by Sunday, and nobody picks it up. I'm not saying that you guys are a bunch of thieves that would pick the money up, but there's a clear profit opportunity here, and the assumption is entrepreneurs are kind of dumb. They're just going to leave it there. They need us economists who are sitting on our butts in our offices at MIT to tell them how to organize their industry. Well, Stephen Chung, like I said, did the unheard of, and he actually became an expert in beekeeping and apple orchard running. And he found that for many generations, the beekeepers and the apple orchard owners had written contracts specifying how much the beekeeper is to be paid, when the bees are to be there. When the apple orchard owner puts pesticides on his trees, he gives 2 weeks' notice to the beekeeper to get the bees out of there so they're not harmed by the pesticides, and so forth. I'll read you one little thing. He says, "This contracts between beekeepers and farmers may be oral or written. I have at hand two types of written contracts. One is formally printed by an association of beekeepers. So the trade association of beekeepers actually had form letters for this. Is you want to make a contract with an apple orchard owner? Here it is. Here's what our lawyers advise you to use this contract. With a few printed headings and space for stipulations to be filled in by hand. Aside from situations where a third party demands documented proof of the contract, written contracts are used primarily for the initial arrangement between the parties. Otherwise, oral arrangements are made. And so that basically is the summary of what he found. And then in the concluding paragraph of Stephen Chung's article, which was also published in the Journal of Law and Economics, he says the problem here, he says, is that some economists have been distilling their policy implications from fables. In a desire to promote government intervention, they have been prone to advance, without the support of careful investigation, the notion of, quote, market failure. And how do they do that? He says they do it by, quote, comparing the ideal with a fable. Nirvana fallacy, comparing the ideal with a fable. And he says, my main criticism concerns their approach to economic inquiry and failing to investigate the real world situation. So that's ignoring reality. That's my point number 4 there. And also ignoring entrepreneurship. You know, the beekeepers and the apple orchard owners are very entrepreneurial in figuring out a long time ago how to wring every last penny out of their investments in beekeeping and apple orchard owning. Okay. There's another interesting article in this literature, and by Steve Margolis, forget his co-author now, I shouldn't, Steve Margolis and Stan Leibowitz, entitled Fable of the Keys. Not Fable of the Bees, Fable of the Keys. Who knows what that is? That's the configuration of the keyboard. Yeah, well, there was an article published in economics literature by an economist named Paul David that argued that this is yet another case of market failure. Because in the story that he told in his article was that there's a different type of keyboard, this. That's not the configuration of letters, that's a man's name, Dvorak, that is superior. And so he invented a new type of market failure, path dependence. He said that there are certain types of technologies that are adopted for whatever reason that are inferior technologies. And so we go down this path and we lock in inferior technologies. And as his example, he used the QWERTY keyboard because he argued that the Dvorak keyboard that was developed in the 1940s, he said, was clearly superior to QWERTY, but for whatever reason, the QWERTY got there 5 minutes earlier. Whatever the reason, it became adopted, and so we're locked into inferior technology. So another fault of the free market is that it locks in inferior technology. And I'm planning on writing a paper on this subject now, and I'm collecting information on government locked in inferior technology. And my best example so far is that the U.S. Nuclear arsenal still uses 1970s era 8-inch floppy disks. You can Google it, you'll find articles on it. The General Services Administration did a big study, and you read this and you're like, holy cow, the nuclear arsenal is running on outdated they even did away with these 8-inch disks and went to 4-inch disks at some point in the floppy disk. But anyway, I'm getting a little away from myself. Fable of the Keys. Well, anyway, Stan Leibowitz and Steve Margolis did yet again the unheard of, and did not rely just on theory, and they didn't really buy the argument that consumers for decades and decades would be satisfied with an inferior technology, or that some entrepreneur wouldn't take this Dvorak keyboard and market it and convince people and improve it and persuade people that this is a competitive product. And so, and not every typewriter, this is back before computers, personal computers, should have the QWERTY keyboard. Well, anyway, what they found out was, and I'll read you some of this. He's not, when they looked into it, they found they wanted to find out, well, where did this Dvorak keyboard come from? Anyway, who made it? Who's new? And so they found a bunch of U.S. Navy studies that were done during World War II, claiming that the Dvorak keyboard was superior to the QWERTY keyboard. And that was the evidence that Paul David, in his article, put. And here's what Leibowitz and Margolis write about this. He said, Earl Strong, a professor at Pennsylvania State University and a one-time chairman of the Office Machine Section of the American Standards Association, reports that the 1944 U.S. Navy experiment and some Treasury Department experiments performed in 1946 were conducted by a Dr. Dvorak, who owned the patent for the keyboard of the Dvorak system and received at least $130,000 from the Carnegie Commission for Education for the studies performed while he was at the University of Washington. And so it's as though Chrysler did studies of cars, comparing Chryslers with Toyotas, and said, we have a series of 10 studies that proves Chryslers are better than Toyotas. And that's what Dvorak did. So that doesn't prove that the QWERTY keyboard is not inferior to the Dvorak keyboard, but it raises some big red flags, doesn't it? There's a conflict of interest here. And so they kept digging, and I love this kind of research. This is, it's guided by economic theory, and it's reality, and it's hard work, it's history, and it's a study of reality, and it's much more convincing than the MIT version of economics, where you sit in a room doing math all day. Not that there's anything wrong inherently with math, but sometimes you have to look outside the window, too. Anyway, they found a whole bunch of 1956 General Service Administration studies that did not support the Dvorak keyboard. And so they took a step further, and they got a grant and hired their own experts to do ergonomic experiments, and they ended up concluding, the experts did, that the QWERTY keyboard is marginally better in terms of words per minute typed with no mistakes. That's not much, but not much. But for whatever reason, the consumers liked it, and so once again they went a little too fast in condemning markets by some combination of the nirvana fallacy, ignoring entrepreneurship, ignoring reality. Out there. Private roads. Walter Block is not here this year, so you're spared the words of our famous roads scholar, Walter, who's been making the case for private roads for about 50 years now. But the original case for private roads, as far as I know, or not for government subsidies for roads, probably the original case was made by Alexander Hamilton himself. He called it internal improvement subsidy. In my book on Hamilton's Curse, I quote him himself saying a pretty good rendition of the free rider problem at the time, that he thought that private funding would not be sufficient for road building. And then that Thomas Jefferson's Treasury Secretary, after Hamilton left and George Washington was out of office, he was an advocate of government subsidies for road building for the same reason they thought a free rider problem. So they both expressed the free rider problem long before there were any textbooks written explaining the free rider problem. But at the same time, private corporations were busy building private roads all over the country. Let's see, I'll give you another example here. And I'm going to read you one short passage. There's an article that was in a journal called Economic Inquiry, which is a pretty high-level journal, pretty good economics journal by Daniel Klein. And Danny Klein was an undergraduate student of mine at George Mason 100 years ago. I lost track of him now. I don't know where he's at now. He taught in California for a while, and I lost track of him. So he's familiar with Austrian economics. He was part of the very beginnings of the They used to call it the Center for Study of Market Processes at George Mason, and now it's the Mercatus Center, I guess. I don't know if they even have that same name anymore. But anyway, he did a study of the building of roads in early America. And we're talking the late 18th century, early 19th century. And here's some of the things he found. And again, he found a whole bunch of books of historians who had studied this. Imagine that. Imagine that an economist who, once again, reads books. Unbelievable. Some years ago, by the way, let me sidetrack myself again. My university would give every freshman a book to read for freshman orientation. And it was the business school's turn to choose the book. And the economics department chairman asked me to be on the committee to choose the book because she told me, you're the only member of the department who reads books. Yeah, it's a true story. It's a true story. That's what the economics department is like. So naturally, I was on the committee to pick a book because no one else would have any idea what book to pick. They don't read books. Yeah. But Danny Klein apparently read some books. And here's what he said. Between 1794 and 1840, 238 private New England turnpike companies built and operated 3,750 miles of roads. New York led all other states in turnpike mileage with over 4,000 as of 1821. Pennsylvania was second, reaching a peak of 2,400 miles in 1832. New Jersey companies operated 550 miles by 1821. Maryland's operated 300 miles of private road in 1830. Turnpikes also represented a great improvement in road quality. And so they did build private roads in early America. And this was about the same time that Hamilton is saying, oh, we need government funding for the roads where we have no roads. And meanwhile, private businesses are doing it. And Dan Klein offers some good explanations of how this happens. He said that these turnpike companies were only paying about a 3% return, and you might have been able to get a 10% return on your money somewhere else, not necessarily even in the United States, in England or someplace. But people invested anyway because they knew that the road would strengthen their community. It would be good for their business. If you had a business and you were connected to the next town over, it would widen your markets. You'd have a bigger market for things. And there was a lot of social ostracism. People who did not invest were sort of socially ostracized, or they wouldn't do business with you. And so in small communities like that, these sort of tools were used to get people to invest. And a lot of people thought it was just in their self-interest to invest in these turnpike companies, especially if it led to greater prosperity for their community, which it did. And so that's another example, I think, that I would point out of being a little too anxious to condemn markets for failing because of the free rider problem without looking at history. Other examples, I published an article years ago called The Myth of Natural Monopoly. And it's been translated into a bunch of different languages. I've had people all over the world contact me over the years to reprint this article on the myth of natural monopoly. And the story, that we're usually told is that, and it's usually told in a historical context to American college students, that in the late 19th, early 20th century, there was the advent of these industries that had heavy fixed costs, like the steel industry, natural gas, water supply, and so forth, telephone. And so as a result of that, they had economies of scale. And economies of scale were leading to a situation, supposedly, where one big company would achieve very low average cost of production, and that would price everybody out of the market. So there would be a natural monopoly of whichever company got there first with this big, large-scale production of whatever it was, water supply, telephone services, and so forth. And therefore, government came in and regulated them in the public interest by doing two things. One, making it legally a monopoly because they wanted the low cost, which the monopoly would give them, but then regulating the price so that it wouldn't be a monopoly price. They'd let them make a profit, but not a monopoly profit. And so that's the public interest theory of regulation. Okay, well, turns out that's another hoax, that never actually happened. And I'll quote Harold Demsetz again. He looked into it. It sounded fishy to him, apparently, at some point. And in his book, Efficiency, Competition, and Public Policy, collection of his journal articles, he says this: 6 electric light companies were organized in the 1 year of 1887 in New York City. 45 electric light enterprises had the legal right to operate in Chicago in 1907. Prior to 1895, Duluth, Minnesota had 5 electric lighting companies. Scranton, Pennsylvania had 4 in 1906. During the latter part of the 19th century, competition was the usual situation in the gas industry in this country, meaning natural gas, I guess. Before 1884, 6 competing companies were operating in New York City. Competition was common and especially persistent in the telephone industry. Baltimore, Chicago, Cleveland, Columbus, Detroit, Kansas City, Minneapolis, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, St. Louis had at least 2 telephone services in 1905. So it never happened that way. It never happened. This natural monopoly never evolved into natural monopoly. And in my article, I looked into it in a lot more detail than just that, and found that when monopoly did occur, the classic example would be what happened in Maryland. The Baltimore Gas and Light Company tried to merge with a couple of other companies and create a monopoly. It didn't work. Mergers didn't work. Too much cheating. Over and over again, they tried it. Didn't work. And so they did what corporations always do when they're trying to achieve a monopoly. They go to the state to get the government to give them a monopoly. And so they did. And so they went to the state of Maryland, and they had them pass a law that said that the state of Maryland would share in the loot that they would get. Now, I'll give you the exact numbers here in a second. I'll tell you how much loot they shared. From the Consolidated Gas Company, it was called, an annual payment to the city of $10,000 a year. This is in 1890, $10,000 a year. That's a couple $100,000 anyway. And 3% of all dividends declared in return for the privilege of enjoying a 25-year monopoly. So that's how natural monopoly came to Maryland. And then once they did that, other cities all over the country thought, well, that's a good way to sort of sneak in a tax increase, raise the electric bill for everybody, or the gas bill, and the consumers will probably blame the gas company. They won't blame the politicians for that. So it was basically a share the loot monopoly scheme, and that's how the natural monopolies came into being. I cite, there's an economist named Walter Primo, spelled Primeaux. And he spent a big part of his career doing statistical studies of the electric power industry. And he wrote a whole book called Direct Utility Competition. And he found out, and this is another guy that got up off his swivel chair, he found out that there are dozens of American cities that never did this, that never went this route, that always allowed direct competition. I mean, not like you have a monopoly in the east side of town and you have a monopoly in the west side of town. Direct competition for all parts of town by multiple companies. And sure enough, what did he find in the electric power business? That there were lower prices, better service, et cetera, everything you would expect from just a little bit of competition. And they also figured out how to minimize the power lines and all that sort of thing. To create minimal, including burying them in some places. And so that's sort of a counterexample to the standard story. But for some reason, the textbooks still ignore all this. They ignore Walter Primo to their shame of the textbooks, because this was and I remember in graduate school reading these articles of his in the Review of Economics and Statistics and Econometrica, and I mean, this was a big time, well-known empirical economists who did these studies in the mainstream, but it's ignored because I guess it's too politically incorrect to do that. And that's my story for now. I guess we have 1 minute in case anybody wants to make a brilliant declaration, or throw a tomato or anything like that, or howl like a wolf one more time. If not, okay.
What was the book you recommended for the committee?
What's that?
Your school?
Oh, the book I recommended to the committee? Well, this is a book, it was a business school's choice. And so I couldn't recommend an economic theory book, because it's the whole everybody. It's all the freshman class, music majors, everybody. So I picked a book on the history of entrepreneurship by John Steele Gordon that I thought at least get them read stories of famous entrepreneurs and how they, what they did in their lives and things. And it was a pretty good, very readable. Anybody could read it. You didn't have to know any economic theory or anything like that. And I knew that they wouldn't accept something like that. But the two left-wingers on the committee threw a fit because it was mostly white males, they told me. There weren't enough, and they were both women, the two lefties. But I tried to tell them, well, that's real American history. I mean, that's the truth about American history. It's not the truth as much today as it was 150 years ago, and it wasn't exclusively males. It went up to pretty modern times, and there were female entrepreneurs in there, but a minority, because that's reality. But really, they wanted some big lefty book like Nickel and Dimed or something like that. And so the university actually had to intervene. The administration had to intervene and pick some administrator to pick the book. And he picked some New York Times commie, some book by some New York Times commie about international trade, about why we need NAFTA, or so, as I recall. And that's the one they picked. I guess we're out of time. It's a quarter of, and that's. Feel free to howl instead of clap if you want. Okay.
Good, how are you? Oh, tell him I said hi back. Oh, thanks. How do you guys know? Okay, yeah, sure. So are you from California or not?
No, actually,
Okay.
but Rhinestone is actually
Right, right. Yep, okay, great. Yeah. All right, very good. Yeah. Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started here? So what we're talking about now is Rothbardians versus free bankers on fractional reserve banking. So let me just define the term at the outset to make sure. I assume most of you here know what these terms mean, but just in case you don't. So there was this guy, Murray Rothbard, perhaps you've heard of him. And so a Rothbardian means, the term fractional reserve banking, so here the idea is you go into a bank, I will just use modern context with modern types of money just to make it simple for those who have never heard this spelled out before. For a lot of you, this is going to be real simple stuff. So you go into a bank and you give them $1,000, and then your checking account balance goes up by $1,000. And so you are walking around town thinking you have in the bank $1,000, but of course they can lend some of that out. All right, and so if instead, if they were to keep full reserves, in the vault or, another some secure place, in a sense, backing up all of those checking account deposits, we would say they have 100% reserves. If instead, though, they only had half of the actual money that people think they could show up at any time and say, give me my money, please, because, I was storing it here, give me my money, it's in a checking account. I go to the ATM, it says I have it available, so I'd like it. If they actually could only satisfy half of all the total outstanding checking account deposits that way, they would have 50% reserves. Okay, so fractional reserve banking means when banks conduct their operations such that they only keep on reserve a fraction of what they would need if everybody who thinks in practice they can just show up and get their money out, to keep that much in reserve to, in a sense, back that up. Okay, so that's what this debate is about. Okay, also a note, you saw in the title that it had free bankers in quotation marks. Okay, and so this is, each year fewer and fewer people get this. This is Dr. Evil because he would talk about his laser beam. Okay, and so the reason in my talk, you know, in the title and so forth, that we have free bankers and free banking in quotation marks is because in a sense that's a misnomer, all right? If what you mean by free banking is you don't want there to be a coercive political state apparatus that imposes regulations and penalties and other things to influence the development of the banking sector in the market economy, well, in that sense, any standard Rothbardian is a free banker too, right? Because they're an anarcho-capitalist, and so there's not going to be a state to lay down regulations insisting on a certain reserve requirement. Okay, so it's just for convenience because the way this debate has played out in the journals, the group of people, and I'll in a minute show you who the participants have been, or some of the major participants, the ones that are arguing in favor of saying, hey, even in a free society, total libertarian world, we think that banks should be allowed to set whatever reserve requirement they want, right? Just like what the fees would be on a checking account or how many armed guards a bank has, that's not a matter of government regulation, and certainly that's not something intrinsic to the legal code, and even in a libertarian world, that's just, you know, bank policy, and, you know, how many tellers they'll have, or how long they'll be open for on Friday afternoons. These are all things that banks should decide based on profit and loss considerations. Likewise, the so-called free bankers, in the context of this debate, they argue that banks should set whatever reserve requirements is profit maximizing, and they think in practice it would be well below 100%. Okay, whereas the 100% reservists, of course, are going to say no. We think in a free society, the banks would tend to have towards 100% reserves or outright 100% reserves. And also, there's some economic dispute in this debate that I'm going to focus on as we go through this. But again, so my point being, in a sense, I'm a free banker, and Joe Salerno's a free banker, and Walter Block's a free banker, in a certain sense, but in the context of this debate, we wouldn't be, and it's just for matters of convenience. It's not because actually we're for necessarily government regulation, since it, you know, wouldn't exist. Okay, let me also just mention, and I'm partly stressing this because when I was younger, I didn't realize this. If you join these debates on the internet, number one, you should reconsider your life choices. But number two, you'll often see it just bandied about that, oh yeah, only those wacky Rothbardians, and I know I contributed perhaps to that belief with the title of my talk being Rothbardians versus, but don't walk away thinking, oh yeah, it's only this crankish group of economists following in the wake of Murray Rothbard and his weird views about banking policy who could endorse 100% reserve banking. That's not true at all. So there's a rich history in this. So for example, Irving Fisher he had a quite famous proposal. And if you go Google Irving Fisher 100% reserves, you'll see it, that in the 1930s they came out. The Chicago school of that time was in favor of 100% reserve banking because they thought that would have helped prevent some of the problems of the Great Depression. Friedrich Hayek also at times in his career came out in favor of it, such that Larry White actually has written an article, I'm not going to get the title perfect, but along the lines of how come Hayek didn't agree with the free bankers, something like that. So this isn't controversial, my claim here, that people in the free banker camp acknowledge that Hayek, at least at points in his career, said things that were favorable to the 100% reserve people. Milton Friedman also, at some points in his career, wrote in favor of 100% reserve banking for various technical reasons. And then more recently, so this was just a few years ago at one of those, I think it was at like the Jackson Hole conference, where monetary economists go and present papers. Nobel laureate Ed Prescott, okay, so not some crank at some obscure university, but a Nobel laureate presented a proposal with a co-author for 100% reserve banking because they thought, studying what happened during the financial crisis of the fall, that had struck in the fall of 2008, Prescott and his co-author thought, oh, you know what, if we actually, if there were an option of 100% reserve checking account balances, a lot of the stuff that, the imbalances that developed that reared their ugly head in the fall of 2008, maybe that could have been mitigated. Okay, so these people aren't all coming at it from the perspective that I'm going to outline in a little bit here from the Austrian, Mises Rothbard line in terms of why they would be in favor of 100% reserve banking. So don't misunderstand. I'm not saying these people are all crypto-Austrians, but the point is this idea that the only people who could possibly be in favor of 100% reserve banking are weirdo Rothbardians, that's not true. Okay, there's other things weirdo Rothbardians are unique for, but not this one. Later in the week, I'll dwell on those other ones. Okay, so just to give you an idea of some of the names of the people involved here. So in the so-called free banker camp, and also, by the way, the reason I put Austrian in quotation marks here, it's not that I'm throwing elbows at somebody, it's because Selgin himself doesn't like labels. So he doesn't want to be called an Austrian economist, not because he has a problem with Austrian economics, but because that constrains him and he's his own man, that sort of thing. All right, so that's why I'm putting the label here. I'm not taking digs at people. So Selgin and White are the two most famous and prolific in the free banker camp who come at this stuff either explicitly as Austrians or from a very Austrian-friendly point of view, and so they understand the points that Rothbardians bring up in this debate. Steve Horowitz is another one who's written a lot on this. On the other side, again, not that I'm enumerating everybody, but just some of the big names you'll see if you read some of the classic exchanges on this topic. You got Guido Hulsmann, Walter Block, Joe Salerno. Oh wait, that's Eric Clapton, sorry, my mistake. You've got the President Murphy, and then also, when I was younger, I was on the other side, okay, and I wasn't thinking clearly back then. Okay, but this wasn't merely a vehicle for me to use a cheap joke here. This is true that when I was younger, I actually agreed more with the people who, called themselves free bankers. And so that's partly why I'm stressing things that, to get rid of misconceptions, because some of that stuff that I used to think too, and then as I read more and realized what the claims actually were. Okay, so again, these are some of the people who, if you read the exchanges, have been weighing in on both sides of the issue. Okay, another thing that it's necessary to clear up, you'll see this right at the outset in some of these debates, is that some people will say, and even trained economists, like I've seen this happen, where they'll learn that, are you kidding me? There's some economists out there who are in favor of 100% reserve banking, not realizing that there's this whole tradition of top flight Nobel Prize winning economists who fall into that camp for various reasons. And they'll say, don't they understand that's how banking works? Like, you couldn't have banking. How could you have somebody, savers they give funds to an intermediary institution and then it lends it out to other people? And how would that even work without having fractional reserve banking? All right, and so this is how many people think about it, not just economists, because the idea is being, well, yeah, if I'm going to give my money to the bank, and then they have to be able to lend it out to earn interest. Otherwise, how are they going to pay me interest? So that's the dilemma that people have. They think that this has to be something intrinsic to banking itself, that fractional reserve banking necessarily goes hand in hand with just banking, because otherwise how would it even be profitable? So that's not correct. All right, so and what's happening here is you're if that's where you're coming from, you're blending together two different distinct functions that banks serve in the modern world. Okay, so one thing is they can maintain what's called demand deposits, meaning you can get that money upon demand. That's where the title comes from. And so just think of like a checking account. Like that's what a demand deposit would be. And so why would you use a demand deposit that's 100% reserves? Because it's for safety and convenience, right? All the reasons that why would you keep your money in a bank? Well, because it's somebody mugs you, they're not going to get access to all of your monetary wealth if you've got a bunch of it in a secure institution. Just the convenience, you're writing big checks to people, you're sliding your debit card. All that stuff is possible because of this point number one here, where it's your money and you're just storing it somewhere safely, and then they come up with convenient ways that you can transfer it to others that don't involve you physically being in possession of it and handing it over to somebody, because then that's inconvenient and also it's risky because you could be liable to getting mugged. All right, so that is what a demand deposit or a checking account balance would be. And then a whole separate function of what modern banks do in practice is to act as credit intermediaries. And so you can call these things time deposits, meaning the person deposits the money for a given amount of time, right? It's not a demand deposit. They can't request it upon demand. Their money's tied up for a contractually specified length of time. And so think of that like as a genuine savings account. Okay, so again, even here, it gets tricky because for a lot of you, probably the distinction between a checking and a saving account at your local bank that you use, in practice, you don't really see what the difference is. But theoretically speaking, these are distinct functions that banks serve. Okay, and so here, the easiest way to think about it is a certificate of deposit or a CD, if you know what that is, right? So you might be driving and you see the bank saying, CDs at 1.2% or whatever it is. And so there the idea is, let's say you give the bank $1,000 and then they give you a piece of paper that's legally binding saying the bearer of this certificate 12 months in the future is entitled to $1,050, let's say. Okay, so that would be a 5% implicit rate of return or yield on that thing. And so what you're doing is you're lending your money to the bank for a year, okay? And if you give them $1,000, they're giving you a claim on the money. That's not money that you hold, right? The CD is not money. It's not part of the money supply. And if I need money, 2 weeks from now, the bank doesn't owe it to you. You can't just show up and say, hey, you know what? That $1,000 has been rolled over for 2 weeks. Can you give me that plus a little bit of the interest? That's not what you're entitled to. It says, no, on this date, that's 12 months in the future, you get $1,050. So what you can do is sell that thing in the secondary market if you want, and somebody else might give you a little bit more than $1,000 for it because they know if they hold on to that thing, they're going to get $1,050, in 11 months and change. So, but it's not contractually guaranteed to you. And if interest rates shift in the meantime from when you gave that $1,000, the amount you get for that thing, like if interest rates go way up in the meantime, then maybe you can sell it and only get $700 back. Okay, so that's the way these things work, all right? So that's, but either way, notice that's a totally distinct function. And so the last little clue here, just in case you're confused, under 100% reserves, there would have to be some way that banks would be paid for providing the services of offering demand deposits, okay? So yes, they have to make that money somehow. And in practice, if they're allowed to engage in fractional reserve banking, then yeah, they eat those costs because they're lending the money out and earning interest from other borrowers. And so they're implicitly paying for it that way, and then they're giving you less, they have a spread. So that's the way a fractional reserve bank does it. But if a bank were being run according to 100% reserves, they would have those two distinct functions. So there would still be savers using banks, and banks would still, perform their role as credit intermediaries. Just think through for a second why that's important. Just make sure I'm not losing anybody. So something like buying a house, if you wanted to, there's a young couple, they both have jobs, and so maybe it makes sense for them to go ahead and get into a house before they can pay for it themselves. And so what happens, they go to a bank, they get a 30-year mortgage or whatever, or maybe in a free society without government intervention, maybe 10-year mortgages would be the norm. I think it would be lower than 30, but let's say that's the case. So the way that works in practice is lots of people around the community save a little bit and give it to the bank, and then the bank has lots and lots of people doing that and gives interest to those savers. And then the bank's staff identify the credit worthiness of the various loan applicants. And so if you didn't have the bank doing that, it would be really difficult for a young couple to take out a mortgage, right? You wouldn't be able to go to knock on 1,000 doors of people in your neighborhood and say, hey, can you each lend us $1,000 or whatever the number has to be to make it work out right, and we'll pay you back a little bit each month, right? Because then that particular couple, they lose their jobs or they skip town or whatever, you've lost all your savings if you were the one lending them all your money. So that's why it makes sense. All the savers go through some of these central institutions that then disperse the money. And so that's how they deal with risk. All right, so that is totally compatible, consistent with 100% reserve banking. It's just the people, for example, who buy a CD and then give funds to the bank that then it lends it out, they would know they can't show up next Tuesday and get access to their money, right? That's not the arrangement they had with the bank. If the bank is doing that, though, it does somehow have to come up with compensation it has to charge for the cost of running the 100% reserve system. Okay, another element of this debate is fraud versus economic consequences. So Rothbard and some people in that tradition, for example, DeSoto, Hoppe, Block, they think it's important in order to get people to see the weirdness or why fractional reserve banking just doesn't make any sense. They want to show that it's inherently fraudulent. All right, and then, so they argue that there's a sense in which it's multiple people with claims on the same piece of property, right? So you put your $1,000 into a bank, into a checking account, and you think it's yours, and then if the bank goes and lends out 900 of it to somebody else, you're still walking around town thinking you have $1,000 in the bank, and yet somebody else now thinks he or she has $900 in the bank, and you're both pointing to the same $1,000 that's in the vault, right? That's the idea. Or maybe they took the 900 and gave it to somebody else, and they're looking at the currency, the green pieces of paper, so they think, yep, this is in my possession, and yet you're still conducting your operations as if you have the full $1,000 at your disposal, right? Because it's available to you upon demand. All right, so some people in these debates argue that that's nonsensical. There's fraud going on there. The bank is simultaneously promising to two people, you can show up and collect this money if you want. We've got it for you, when they know in practice they can't. If there's a bank run, then the lie is exposed and the bank is caught with its pants down, right? So some people stress that, and there's a whole legal history that like DeSoto gets into about the difference between lending something to somebody versus giving to them in a caretaker fashion, right? Like if you check a coat at your restaurant, you go into a restaurant and there's a coat check and you give them the garment and then they give you a ticket, you don't think that actually what they're doing is lending the coat out to other people who need it, and they're just saying, no, we'll have a garment for here when you come, trust us. Right? You see how that works? And if you saw that they were doing that, you would think, so it wouldn't merely be that, okay, I better not show up and give you this ticket and you don't have my coat. It's beyond that. If you found out that they were lending the coat out to other people, you'd say, what are you doing? Okay, so there's that type of arrangement, and so DeSoto and some others in this tradition argue that historically that's how it should have been handled, and then it was government intervention, they claim, that where the bankers had a lot of sway in the legal community and with the government, and that's how they got the rulings to be such that it was considered, oh no, when you make a deposit with a bank, really what you're doing is lending them money. So they still owe you money back, but the property switches, the title switches hands. That's the way the legal ruling went, and so people in this tradition argue that it shouldn't have gone that way, that is nonsensical. Okay, the way the free bankers then counter that is they'll argue with history and say, look, if this was a voluntary choice, everybody has known for a long time that the bank doesn't, have your money in a little drawer with your name on it. Everybody knows fractional reserve banking happens. Otherwise, how could they pay you interest on checking accounts? So it's voluntary. The market has ruled, and in history, we don't see a lot of 100% reserve banks, do we? And so it shows that doesn't pass the market test. All right, so I'm just here summarizing some of the back and forth. But what I want to stress is that's, when I was younger, I thought that was the crux of the debate. And what Joe Salerno has stressed is that that's really not the issue when it comes to the business cycle. Okay, so for Salerno, and I agree with him, the really interesting and fruitful part of the discussion as economists, because we're not legal theorists, is to focus on, does fractional reserve banking cause the Austrian boom-bust cycle? All right, and so it's not that Salerno is conceding one way or the other on the fraud issue. He's just saying, let's not focus on that, and let's instead, as economists, focus on this issue of the business cycle. And so that's what I have done also. And so here, it really does, I think, clear up some of the misconceptions. And so if you were leaning towards the free banker side saying, come on, it's voluntary, I don't really, how could it be fraudulent if everybody knows what's going on? And the 100% reservists have a response to that, by the way. So, Hoppe or Walter Block, they'll say something like, if somebody, we have a voluntary contract and someone agrees that you're going to give him $100 and he's going to give you a square circle, that's still a nonsensical contract, even if it's voluntary, right? Because a square circle doesn't make any sense. So that's how they deal with that sort of argument. But the point is, as Salerno says, we can put that to the side, and that's an interesting issue, but as economists, let's focus on whether or not fractional reserve banking causes the business cycle. So here, for just a little bit of context before I move on, let me just make sure you realize this. Don't get caught into a trap where if somebody asks you, oh, so you Austrians, what do you think about what causes the business cycle? if you say the Federal Reserve or if you say central banks cause it, then the obvious retort is to say, oh, well, apparently you don't know your history. Don't you know there were all sorts of financial crises and panics and depressions with a small d, like in the United States, even before the Federal Reserve, and even in periods where there might not have been a national bank established, okay? And so and that's correct. So strictly speaking, the theory of the business cycle that Mises developed in what has been translated as the theory of money and credit, his 1912 book, that's a theory of how fractional reserve banking, or what he called the issuance of fiduciary media, causes the boom-bust cycle, right? So central banks exacerbate the problem, but the issue is not central banking per se. The issue is fiduciary media, okay? And so this leads into my next point about the nuanced position of Mises. When I was younger and looking at this debate, I thought both sides had great points, that, you know, the so-called free bankers could produce lots of quotes from Mises in support of their position, so it seemed to me, and the anti-free banker, 100% reservists, let's say, they also could produce a bunch of quotes from Mises that seemed to support what they were saying. And so I concluded at the time that, you know, Mises either was contradicting himself or that his views just changed over, you know, he had a long career and, you know, his views changed. And that's what I thought was happening. But actually, within the last several years, the more I was studying this and reading the work of Salerno in particular, showed me that, no, on most of these issues, so I'm putting a question mark here that, you know, maybe somebody can produce a quote that I won't be able to explain in this way. But for just about all the ones, you know, the major ones that ostensibly look like it's Mises praising free banking, so he is, but it's not because he's admitting that very low reserve requirements are consistent with, you know, an economy that's free from the business cycle. That's not what he's claiming. If you go and look at a lot of these ones, Mises is consistently saying, on the one hand, that the issuance of fiduciary media, so fiduciary media just means money that's, it's like a ticket that the bank issues that's not backed up by actual money in the vault. So it's a claim on money that's not backed up by genuine money in the vault. So to issue fiduciary media means to engage in fractional reserve banking. So Mises has crystal clear quotes, even in Human Action, right? So it's not just when he's younger, but even in Human Action, where he says that the issuance of new fiduciary media sets in motion the boom-bust cycle, you know, period, end of story. And he says, now, if it's just a little bit, then it's going to be a small business cycle. But the point being, there's no such thing as a correct amount or an amount of fiduciary media that would not set into motion the business cycle, all right? So he says that explicitly. Elsewhere in Human Action, he's in favor of what he calls free banking. So it looks like, well, man, this guy, he's inconsistent. If you read it, though, with this interpretation, everything makes perfect sense, is that Mises doesn't trust the state, at least as of his writing in Human Action. Elsewhere in his career, by the way, he does explicitly call for a legal requirement of 100% reserves. All right, so just to show you that even to go so far as that is something that Mises dabbled with at one point in his career, where he thought that was the only way to ensure a sound money. But for the passages in Human Action, it's clear what he's saying is you can't trust the state, right? Even if they insisted on a 100% reserve requirement, the next time there's a major war and they want to run the printing press, they would just relax that requirement. And so they would tell the banks, don't worry, you can go ahead and, you know, issue money above and beyond what you have in the, you know, issue credit above and beyond what you have from savers giving you in the vault. Go ahead and do that, it's fine. So his point was the best way to ensure the long run stability of the money and banking sector and to prevent the boom bust cycle, which emanates from fractional reserve banking, is to just not have the government get involved at all, because Mises thought normal market forces would constrain banks so that if any one bank expanded too rapidly by lowering its reserve requirements, then there would be adverse clearing with respect to the other banks. And so pretty soon the reserves of the one bank that was expanding rapidly, so let's say all the banks in the community have 95% reserves, and then one bank gets aggressive and lowers its reserve ratio down to 50%, so it's issuing more loans, it's doing more business, it's earning more interest payments, so that looks good. But the point is that bank's customers now, they have more notes in their possession, other things equal, than all the other banks' customers do. So in the course of normal operations, there's going to be more notes issued by the expanding bank than all the other ones. So at the end of the week or the month, when the banks all settle up with each other, the other banks are going to have more claims on the expanding bank than vice versa. And so on net, they're going to say, okay, here, we've got 1,000 ounces of gold that you owe us, and we only owe you 200 ounces of gold, and so you owe us on net 800 ounces. So go ahead and settle up. And so the point is the genuine money stock would flow out of that one expanding bank's vaults into the other one. So that's why in equilibrium, no single bank can expand too rapidly relative to its peers. Okay, and so I've shown you that one bank can have significantly lower reserve requirements than everybody else, but now why can't all the banks, just as a cartel, agree to inflate? Well, as long as it's an unregulated sector, just like it's as opening a pizza shop or something, somebody else can set up a bank, right? So if all the existing banks collude and get together and say, let's all agree to lower reserve requirements to 50%, we'll all inflate in unison, and so our reserves, won't get drained from each other because we'll all do it together. Somebody could just start a new bank that has 60% reserves, and then that bank would over time get all of the reserves from the other ones, okay? So that's the kind of logic Mises had in mind, and so that's why he was saying, as a practical matter, the best way to constrain the practice of issuing fiduciary media or to keep reserve requirements high is to not have the government be involved with it at all. Just leave it to genuine market forces, because he thought competition would quickly penalize any one bank that tried to expand too rapidly, okay? Notice how central banks do the opposite of what they're supposed to do. What would check that feedback mechanism I just walked you through, where if all the banks collude together, you could just start up a new bank? Well, what if it's hard to open a bank, right? Right now, you can't just open a bank. There's all sorts of regulations you have to jump through. So that's the way they limit competition. And the other problem with expanding too rapidly is if there's a run, you get caught with your pants down. And so what does the central bank do? It's the primary reason for its existence is what? It's a lender of last resort. That's what it says it's doing. So just think through what that means. That means when private banks get into trouble and they're illiquid, right, then the central bank comes in and rescues them. So again, the very things that Mises thought in the market would penalize overly aggressive expansion on the part of the banks, that's what the central bank by its very nature dismantles or minimizes, okay? So you see how it's the opposite of what you think that the public has been taught. The central bank weeds out, fly-by-night organizations and keeps the public using sound currency when it's the other way around. But in terms of this debate, what I'm saying is, certainly in human action, the other ones that have been brought to my attention, when Mises at times praises free banking, it's not because he's saying fractional reserve banking is actually benign and promotes coordination in the loan markets. That's not what he's saying. He's just saying that that's the best way practically to, in other words, don't trust the government to maintain 100% reserves, because you can't trust them to do that. Okay, the one last thing I'll say on this before moving on is, it gets a little bit subtle, but Mises does at times admit that if it weren't for fractional reserve banking, the purchasing power of money would have risen rapidly at certain points in history. Like as more people started using gold over the earth, that would have increased the purchasing power of gold. So there would have been price deflation measured in gold ounces, except for the credit expansion that fractional reserve banking offered. So at best, you can put that as one of the things in favor of fractional reserve banking to be held up against the fact that it causes the business cycle. So I still have not seen anybody showing me quotes from Mises saying that it doesn't cause the business cycle. Incidentally, maybe Mises was wrong, right? So this isn't a definitive knockdown argument, but my point is, it's not merely some crankish thing that Murray Rothbard believed, that the position that Salerno's advancing here, that fractional reserve banking per se is what causes the Austrian boom-bust cycle, was something that Mises himself, I think, pretty clearly developed and believed in. And since Mises developed Austrian business cycle theory, that's a pretty good indication that the two are linked. Okay, so what is the free banker response on this type of issue? So Selgin et al., they argue that under free banking, it's a pretty subtle point. And so if you're really into this stuff, I encourage you to read in this literature and see it, because this was more nuanced than I initially thought going into it. And so what he argues is that they only issue additional fiduciary media when the community wants to save more. Okay, so let me just take a minute here. We still got plenty of time. Let me just make sure you get his argument. So the claim is, again, what's fiduciary media? It's, let's imagine it's gold. Gold is the money in this economy, and so prices are quoted in ounces of gold or, you know, pounds of gold, what have you. And there's banks that are private, right? We're imagining a free society here. There's no political system. So there's free banks, they're private, and they issue claims on the gold, right? So rather than walking around with 10 pounds of gold on you, which is heavy, you have pieces of paper that's saying the bearer of this note is entitled to 1 ounce of gold, let's say. All right, and you got a bunch of those things in your pocket. Or you have a checking account, you know, you have a checkbook you can write checks on. And so what Selgin and White and these people are arguing is to say the only situation in which the private banks would find it profitable to print up more of these tickets and issue them as loans into the community and thereby lower the rate of interest, right? So that's what Mises is saying would set up the boom-bust cycle. That the banks, they issue more fiduciary media, it's not backed up by genuine saving. In order to advance those more loans out there, the rate of interest comes down, it's not the correct interest rate, it sets up an artificial boom, and then when the banks chicken out and stop pumping in so much extra credit, the bust happens, right? So that's Mises' position. The way the free bankers counter that is they say, no, actually, the only time, if you run through the logic and you see what are the incentives facing a commercial bank in this type of system that they're envisioning, they're saying the only time they would want to issue more fiduciary media and thereby push down the rate of interest is when people in the community want to save more. So they're agreeing that, yes, you have an initial equilibrium and then all of a sudden the banks want to lower the reserve ratios and print up more tickets even though there's not more gold in the vault. So there's more people in the community holding tickets saying, you know, the owner of this ticket can go to Acme Bank at any branch and get an ounce of gold. There's more of those tickets now that the community is holding. In order to get that flow to go out there, the rate of interest dropped. So somebody like Salerno or me would say, see, issuing more fiduciary media pushed down the rate of interest even though there wasn't saving. It wasn't that people deposited more gold with the banks. There's the business cycle, right? That's the wrong rate of interest. That's not the natural rate. It's too low. It's artificially low. It sets up the boom-bust cycle. And the free banker response is, no, the very act of someone in the community choosing to hold more notes issued by Acme Bank or whatever is implicitly the owner of that note or the holder of that note making a loan to the bank. All right? So it's a very clever argument. So if it were correct, I think it would go through, right? In other words, they would have shown in their type of system, the only time the banks would issue more fiduciary media and lower the rate of interest is when the community voluntarily saved more. And again, the bank would just be an intermediary. So that's what they're trying to do. So it's a very clever approach. I just don't think it doesn't make sense to me economically. I don't think it's correct. So one thing is, and I'll show you a paper here at the end if you want to go see the source, Mises explicitly dealt with that type of argument in 1912 in the Theory of Money and Credit. And he said, some people think that holding fiduciary media involves an implicit lending of funds to the bank. And Mises says that that's not correct. And so his argument is, if I'm holding a note, like from Acme Bank, or let's say Citibank, that says the owner of this can present it at any Citibank and get an ounce of gold upon demand. And so the free bankers are arguing that there I've implicitly lent the ounce of gold to Citibank, right? Because I could go get it, but I'm choosing not to. And so it's remaining in their possession as I walk around town with this note, rather than going and turning it in and getting the gold ounce. So they're saying, in a sense, I've lent Citibank the gold ounce, and so therefore the interest rate should have fallen because I just engaged in more lending. But what Mises is arguing is that no, when you understand what fiduciary media is and how it is accepted by most people in the community at par with the genuine underlying base money, then you realize it's not a loan, okay? And this is why Mises goes through the whole thing. We don't have time, and also I don't want to bore you too much here, but why Mises developed this notion of fiduciary media, okay? And so it's claims on money that are instantly redeemable and that the community accepts as being interchangeable with money, but it's not actually money proper. That's what fiduciary media are. And why did he develop that? Because he thought this was necessary to understand the business cycle. Because what happens is the weird thing about claims on banks, at least reputable ones, is that the public treats those things as basically interchangeable with actual money. So when you're walking around a developed market economy with notes from Citibank saying the owner of this is entitled to an ounce of gold, you can go into the store and spend it just as well as you can spend the actual gold ounces. Okay, and so the point is you're not actually making a loan to the bank because you still have a present good. Anything that having the actual gold in your possession would entitle you to, or any services it provides by having gold in your cash balances, is also satisfied by holding fiduciary media. Okay, and so don't get lost here, because this people get into arguments. There's a dispute about whether acquiring larger cash balances constitutes saving. And that question is not relevant to the particular one here. What the free bankers need to argue is that you've got cash in you've got gold in your possession. And I agree that by adding that to your cash balances, you're saving. Like I saved an ounce of gold, so now I have an extra ounce of gold in my cash balances. And now if I go and give it to a bank and they give me a note saying the owner of this note can get an ounce of gold, that's an additional act of saving on top of it, right? Because that's what they need, that's what they would need to argue. And I'm saying that doesn't follow, all right? That just swapping the form in which you're holding your cash doesn't constitute an additional act of saving. And so that shouldn't further push down the rate of interest. And I have a little reductio ad absurdum. So in the free banker vision or worldview, why would it be good? How does it promote coordination or equilibration, like they say? You can have a situation where imagine everybody all of a sudden wants to save more. They want to hold more cash. They get fearful for the future. Under 100% reserve banking, this would, they claim, lead to a painful adjustment process where people don't want to spend as much. They reduce their spending because they're trying to build up their cash balances. And so prices would have to come down and more gold would have to be mined, right? If we're in a 100% reserve community that uses gold as the money, if all of a sudden everybody wanted to double the amount of gold in his or her possession, then what happens is a combination of more gold gets mined and prices quoted in gold come down until the point at which the real purchasing power of your gold holdings has doubled for everybody. And they're saying that's a painful process. What if instead the banks could just print more tickets, right? And then that would satisfy, everybody would have more, their purchasing power measured in terms of gold and tickets would go up. We don't have to go the costly method of digging up more gold, and we don't have to wait for the painful, sluggish process of prices coming down because prices are sticky. They just are, and that's, so that's their argument. And so as I pointed out, what's weird in that situation, just if you go through their logic, is if you said, okay, let's imagine that it's a situation where everybody just wants to double his or her holdings and the banks just print up more tickets. And so everybody just gets more tickets, so now everyone has twice as much gold measured in tickets that they borrowed from the bank. And now I say, okay, how did that happen? Isn't that, that pushes down interest rates, isn't that going to cause the boom bust cycle? They're saying no, because they're implicitly making a loan. And so if you think it through, how was it possible that everybody in the community all of a sudden had more tickets? It's because everybody lent himself that extra money, right? You see that? And so if you say to someone, where'd you get those tickets from? You'd say, oh, I lent it to myself. And that's how you doubled your cash holdings, all right? And so it's, when you think it through that way, you realize, wait, there's something screwy there, that can't be right, okay? Whereas when it's just one-off things and one person, is holding the notes and maybe you could see it and somebody else borrowed it. Because normally, the bank expands and some business will borrow the notes, spend it, and then someone else in the community will be the reservoir. Well, that note will end up and they'll add it to their cash balances. And so the free bankers argue, oh, that person where it landed implicitly lent the money to the expanding business owner. But when I make it symmetrical like that, where everyone in the community just expands his or her cash holdings, which the banking system accommodates by printing up more tickets, you can see that, that process doesn't work. That means everybody implicitly lent himself the extra funds available to bolster his cash balances. That doesn't make any sense. And certainly, you're not creating genuine savings through that. All right, so that's the way I would handle that particular claim. Another claim that Selgin often dwells on is pointing at the historical successes of the free banker vision, and the two he singles out are Scotland and Canada. And so, again, I'm not putting words in his mouth. Clearly, you can go, and if you read the paper I'll link to at the end here, you'll see that Selgin holds these up as the best examples historically of free banking in action. And so that's ironic, because as Murray Rothbard detailed, Scotland suspended specie redemption for more than a decade. Okay, and so again, what that means is during the period that the free bankers point at Scotland and say, this is a good example, you know, nothing's perfect, but this is a good example of our principles in operation, you can see it working here, that the Scottish banks, if you showed up and said, yep, I have gold on deposit with you, you see, here it is, here's the receipt, I'd like my gold, please, they would say no. You have notes from us, that should be good enough for now. And it wasn't just that they suspended redemption for a week or two. Again, it was for a long period of time, and that happened during the alleged period of the free banker success story. As far as Canada, Selgin pointed to, in one of his blog posts, this book on Canadian banking history, saying this outlines how great the Canadian system worked, at least when it first started, before there was more and more political intervention. But again, and Selgin gives these years for when the banking system in Canada approximated his free banking ideals and said it was remarkably stable. So I went and looked up, I went and pulled the book up and I saw, so this is the book he was talking about, and the chapter dealing with the time period in question, this is what it says. So it's banking under the Confederation, the expansion between 1867 and 73, then depression, then bank failures and losses. Okay, and so which is ironic, because this is, if Murray Rothbard wanted to point to a historical example to show this is the danger of unrestrained fractional reserve banking, this is the poster child. This is literally exactly what the 100% reservists say would happen, is that, oh yeah, there's an expansion, there's this apparent prosperity, but then there's an economic crash, and then there's bank failures. That's exactly what it does here. And so, and with some of the back and forth, the last thing I'll leave you with here is for more reading. So the stuff I'm drawing on in this talk, I had it come out in a recent paper in the QJ in the spring of 2019, More Than Quibbles, Problems with the Theory and History of Fractional Reserve Free Banking, if you want to see more of this. And just so he doesn't think I'm ignoring him, so Selgin did respond to this talk I just gave. He had an earlier response to that, which you can see if you just Google Bob Murphy on free banking in Canada, you'll see. But if you go look at it, it's not that I'm ignoring his response, it's that we're talking past each other. Like what Selgin does is just point out, oh, well, there's certain other things that were good in the Canadian system, like the allocated credit and that's difficult to quantify, number one, but also that's not really what the claim was. The Rothbardian type claim that I think goes back to Mises is that fractional reserve banking per se causes the business cycle, the boom-bust cycle, because when banks lend money that hasn't first been deposited with them from savers, they're in a sense acting as if there's more savings than there really are. That pushes down interest rates. That's not the correct interest rate, and that causes the boom-bust cycle, or at least that's the claim. And so to point to an example where there was clearly a boom-bust cycle right after this system was instituted is entirely consistent with that. So Selgin doesn't go through and try to explain why it doesn't cause the boom-bust cycle. He just points to other issues. So partly it's disappointing because we're talking past each other. The last thing I'll mention is one of the things Selgin does is he'll contrast the U.S. experience with the Canadian experience. And it's true, the U.S., like during the 1930s, there were a lot of bank failures in the U.S. there weren't in Canada, and that has to do with various restrictions like on what's called unit banking laws in the United States. So what Selgin can do is show systems that had a lot more government intervention than the places that he's holding up as ideal free banking scenarios had a lot worse things happen in their financial system. And yeah, of course that's true, right? Just like I wouldn't, but it's like saying price controls aren't a big deal because look at New York City right now. Look at the price controls. Would you rather live in New York City or the Soviet Union? Right? You see what I'm saying? That doesn't exonerate price controls. It just means, yeah, that by itself isn't as bad as outright full-blown central planning. So likewise, if Selgin's pointing to a country that had fractional reserve banking backed up by government privileges and cartels for the banks, and also had restrictions on, branch banking or had other sorts of things that the banks had to buy government bonds or whatever, yeah, that's going to be worse than a place that's a free banking ideal. But as we've seen, even the place he holds up as the ideal, they still suspend specie redemption. And the other example, they still have depression and bank failures. Okay, that's my time. Thanks, everybody. Yep.